their maths, but also the introduction of a new specialist maths schools as, again, making sure that young people have the opportunity to really excel in mathematics, as is so vital in terms of...
Chamberlain.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. At St Andrews University, my constituency, a number of students are unable to start their studies due to difficulties getting visas and visa decisions. Can I therefore ask the Universities Minister if she's aware of these delays with international students and what conversations are being had with the Home Office accordingly?
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm more than happy to meet with the Honourable Member, and I work very closely with my colleague in the Home Office to assist and make it as smooth as possible, as international students are vital to this country, not just economically but culturally and for our society as well.
Bob Blackman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I was going to wear my headset, especially for you, but I couldn't find anywhere to plug it in. My right honourable friend has recently had a meeting to discuss defibrillators in schools, and I wonder if you could give us an update on where that will happen and how we can make sure that schools are safe for everyone.
Minister.
Well, it was very incredibly moving to speak to Mark King, listening to his tragic experience of losing his son Oliver, and he was joined by Jamie Carragher as well. And it really does focus the need for us to do as much as possible in order to encourage schools to have defibrillators. That's why we'll be looking at changing the regulations that are underpinned by secondary legislation in order to ensure that all schools do have defibrillators in the future and hopefully prevent such tragedy visiting more families.
Rachel Muskell.
Here. Safeguarding young people in statutory settings like schools must always be a priority. Yet the same children in community settings are being exposed to huge risks, including consuming large volumes of alcohol, exposed to drug dealing, and also sexual exploitation. So will the Minister meet with me to discuss the lack of youth provision for our young people and the importance of putting these services in place, like on the Little Naysmire in York?
Here. Minister.
I absolutely agree that we need to have more for our young people to do, which is why it's been so brilliant over this summer to see our amazing holiday and activities programme, which has given young people access to opportunities they never had before and help give them confidence, build their well-being, close the attainment gap as well as food. I'd be more than happy to meet her to find out more what's happening in her.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It was great to visit the excellent Ilfracombe Church of England Primary School's holiday, activity and food programme. But this was one of only a handful of these programmes in my rural North Devon constituency. What steps is my honourable friend taking to ensure more students can access them in the future?
Mr Speaker, I'd like to really thank all those honourable members who visited their HAF programmes this summer. They had so much fun, and I'm delighted actually that participation was so high the first time we ever had this type of project for our children. Local authorities are already setting out their plans for this Christmas, and let's make sure that we get to even more kids.
Reeves.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Over the past decade, there's been a 47% decrease in drama and a 36% drop in music participation in schools. A broad curriculum is vital to young people's life chances, yet access often depends on parents' ability to pay for these activities. I heard what the Minister had to say about the music curriculum, but unless the government commits to providing the resources to all schools to provide creative arts education, young people will be let down. What will the Minister do about it? Will he provide that funding?
Minister.
We are committed to arts education. The proportion taking at least one GCSE in an arts subject has remained broadly stable over the last 10 years. And also we're committed to very significant sums of funding for arts and music projects, £620 million over the last 3 years, including £79 million for the 119 music education hubs, £148 million for the music and dance scheme. We are very committed to the arts and to drama in our schools.
Bill Lewis.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Will the Secretary of State kindly speak with the Secretary of State for the Home Department about getting visas about getting visas for the 12 at-risk Afghan scholars, some still in hiding, some in Pakistan, who have been awarded sponsored places by high-quality British universities and need the visas to take them up.
I will most certainly undertake to do that, and I think we've seen the education community in the United Kingdom coming together in order to support those who want to resettle from Afghanistan here in this country. But I will certainly undertake that, and we also want to look at the opportunities for those brilliant, amazing people from Afghanistan and other opportunities they can play in our part in the education system here in the UK.
We now come to the statement on Afghanistan from the Prime Minister. Prime Minister.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With your permission, I will update the House on the situation in Afghanistan and our enduring effort to provide sanctuary for those to whom we owe so much. Since the House last met, our armed forces, diplomats and civil servants have completed the biggest and fastest emergency evacuation in recent history, overcoming every possible challenge in the most harrowing conditions and bringing 15,000 people to safety in the UK, and helping 36 other countries airlift their own nationals. They faced the pressure of a remorseless deadline and witnessed a contemptible terrorist attack at the very gates of the airport, with 2 British nationals and 13 of our American allies among the dead. But they kept going, and in the space of a fortnight, they evacuated our own nationals alongside Afghan friends of this country who guided, translated and served with our soldiers and officials, proving their courage and loyalty beyond doubt, sometimes in the heat of battle. The whole House will join me in commending the courage and ingenuity of everyone involved in the Kabul airlift, one of the most spectacular operations in our country's post-war military history. This feat exemplified the spirit of all the 150,000 British servicemen and women who deployed in Afghanistan over the last 2 decades, of whom 457 laid down their lives and many others suffered trauma and injury. Thanks to their efforts, no terrorist attack against this country or any of our Western allies has been launched from Afghanistan for 20 years. They fulfilled the first duty of the British Armed Forces to keep our people safe, and they and their families should take pride in everything they did. Just as they kept us safe, so we shall do right by our veterans. In addition to the extra £3 million we've invested in mental health support through NHS Op Courage, we're providing another £5 million to assist military charities who do such magnificent work, with the aim of ensuring that no veteran's request for help will go unanswered. And now the evacuation of Pitting will give way to Operation Warm Welcome, with an equal effort to help our Afghan friends begin their new lives here in the United Kingdom, and recognising the strength of feeling across the House about the plight of individual Afghans. Years before this episode, we began to fulfil our obligation to those Afghans who had helped us, bringing 1,400 to the UK. Then, in April this year, we expanded our efforts by opening the Afghan relocations and assistance policy. And even before the onset of Operation Pitting, we'd brought around 2,000 to the UK between June and August, and our obligation lives on. So let me say to anyone to whom we've made commitments and who is currently in Afghanistan, we are working urgently with our friends in the region to secure safe passage, and as soon as routes are available, we will do everything possible to help you to reach safety. Over and above this effort, the UK is formally launching a separate resettlement programme, providing a safe and legal route for up to 20,000 Afghans in the region over the coming years, with 5,000 in the first year. We are upholding Britain's finest tradition of welcoming those in need. And I emphasise that under this scheme we will of course work with the UN and aid agencies to identify those we should help, as we have done in respect of those who fled the war in Syria. But we will also include Afghans who have contributed to civil society or who face a particular risk from the Taliban, for example, because of their role in standing up for democracy and human rights, or because of their gender or sexuality or religion. All who come to our country through this safe and legal route will receive not a 5-year visa, but indefinite leave to remain. And our support will include free English courses for adults and 300 university scholarships. We will shortly be writing to local authorities and the devolved administrations with details on funding for extra school places and long-term accommodation across the UK. I'm grateful for everything they are doing, and of course for the work of my honourable friend, the Minister for Afghan Resettlement. I'm delighted but not surprised that across our country people have been fundraising for our Afghan friends, and we've received numerous offers of help from charities and ordinary families alike. And anyone who wishes to join that effort can do so through gov.uk. Mr. Speaker, our first duty is to the security of the United Kingdom. And if the new regime in Kabul wants international recognition and access to the billions of dollars currently frozen in overseas accounts, then we and our friends will hold them to their agreement to prevent Afghanistan from ever again becoming an incubator for terrorism, and we shall insist on safe passage for anyone who wishes to leave and respect for the rights of women and girls. Our aim is to rally the strongest international consensus behind these principles, so that as far as possible the world speaks to the Taliban with one voice. To that end, I called an emergency meeting of the G7 leaders, which made these aims the basis of our common approach. And the UK helped to secure a UN resolution passed by the Security Council last week, making the same demands. Later this month at the UN General Assembly in New York, I'll work with the UN Secretary General Guterres and other leaders to widen that consensus still further. We will judge the Taliban by their actions, not their words, and use every economic, political and diplomatic lever to protect our own countries from harm and to help the Afghan people. We've already doubled the UK's humanitarian and development assistance to £286 million this year, including to help people in the region. Mr. Speaker, on Saturday, we shall mark the 20th anniversary of the reason why we went into Afghanistan in the first place. The terrorist attacks on the United States, which claimed 2,977 lives, including those of 67 Britons. And if anyone is tempted to say that we have achieved nothing in that country, or still tempted to say, Mr. Speaker, that we have achieved nothing in that country in 20 years, tell them that our armed forces and those of our allies enabled 3.6 million girls to go to school. Tell them that this country and the Western world were protected from al-Qaeda in Afghanistan throughout that period. And tell them, Mr. Speaker, that we have just mounted the biggest humanitarian airlift in recent history. 8 times, the RAF rescued more than 400 people on board a single plane, the most that had ever travelled on an RAF aircraft in its 103-year history, helping thousands of people in fear for their lives, helping thousands to whom this country owes so much, and thereby revealing the fundamental values of the United Kingdom. There are very few countries that have the military capability to do what we have just done, and fewer still that would have felt the moral imperative to act in the same way. We can be proud of our armed forces and everything they have achieved, and for the legacy they leave behind, and what they did was in the best traditions of this country, and I commend this statement to the House.
Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Prime Minister for an advance copy of his statement. The heroes on the ground of Operation Pitting are the best of us. The ambassador stayed to process every case that he could. Paratroopers lifted people from the crush. Afghan soldiers continued to serve alongside us to the end. And thousands of others risked their lives to help others escape. They faced deadly violence and deliberately engineered chaos with courage, with calm and with determination. Thanks to their remarkable efforts, thousands were evacuated, British nationals have returned safely to their families, and Afghan friends are starting a new life here in Britain. Speaking directly to those who served in Operation Pitting, I say thank you. Your service deserves recognition and honour, and I hope that the Prime Minister will accept Labour's proposal to scrap the 30-day continuous service rule so that medals are awarded for your bravery. The entire army, our armed forces and veterans deserve proper support for mental health. The new funding announced today is welcome, but it's unlikely to be enough. Previous funding was described, Mr. Speaker, as scandalous by the Select Committee, and the Office for Veterans Affairs is still being cut. All those involved deserved political leadership equal to their service, but they were let down. They were let down on strategy. The Prime Minister underestimated the strength of the Taliban, despite intelligence warnings that rapid Taliban advances could lead to the collapse of the Afghan security forces, a return to power of the Taliban, and our embassy shutting down amid reduced security. The government continued to act on the assumption that there was no path to military victory for the Taliban. Complacent and wrong. They were let down, Mr. Speaker, by lack of planning. 18 months passed between the Doha Agreement and the fall of Kabul. Yet, as the Prime Minister now concedes, only 2,000 of the 8,000 people eligible for the Arab scheme had been brought to Britain. 2,000 of 8,000. A strategic review was published to much fanfare, but it didn't mention the Taliban, NATO withdrawal, or the Doha Agreement. And the Prime Minister only convened a G7 meeting on Afghanistan after Kabul was lost. Because of this lack of leadership, the government has left many behind to whom we owe so much. MPs in the last few weeks have had thousands of desperate calls from people trying to get to safety. Many remain in danger, including the Afghan guards who protected the British Embassy. In my constituency, and I'm not alone, members across the House will have had this, Afghans who applied for the Arab scheme weeks ago, sometimes months ago, who were clearly eligible, but weren't processed quickly enough by this government, didn't make it to the planes. And the stress levels of them and their families and all of our teams and caseworkers has been palpable in the last few weeks and months. A familiar and desperate story to many across this House, on both sides. The government doesn't even know how many UK nationals and how many Afghans eligible under the Arab scheme have been left behind to the cruelty of the Taliban. A national disgrace. Even if they could identify who they'd left behind, the government doesn't have a plan to get everybody out. Kabul airport remains closed to international flights. Safe passage has not been created to Afghans' neighbours. And whatever the Prime Minister says today, there is no international agreement on the resettlement of Afghan refugees. We have a Prime Minister incapable of international leadership just when we needed it most. I know it's uncomfortable. The terrible attacks from ISIS-K highlight the new security threat. The government must act quickly to coordinate international partners to ensure the Afghan government's collapse does not lead to a vacuum for terrorists to fill. And there's a desperate need for humanitarian support. The return to 2019 levels of aid spending is necessary, and where's the plan to ensure it doesn't fall into the wrong hands? Mr. Speaker, to those that have managed to escape Afghanistan and have arrived here in the UK, we say welcome. I know you will give as much to this country as you make it your new home. All you need is help and support. And I'm pleased that indefinite leave to remain will now be granted to all those who arrive by safe and legal routes. Local authorities across the country are trying to play their part. but they've been in the dark as to how many people they'll be asked to support and what resources they will have to do so. So we will look at the details. We will look at the details of the letter the Prime Minister referred to and examine the details. History will tell the tale of Operation Pitting as one of immense bravery. We are proud of all those who contributed, their story made even more remarkable by the fact that whilst they were saving lives, our political leadership was missing in action. Thank you.
Well, Mr. Speaker, there weren't many questions that the right honourable gentleman put to me. In that, he made the general assertion that the government hadn't been focusing on Afghanistan, but as far as I can remember, he didn't even bother to turn up to the first of the 3 statements I've given on Afghanistan in this House, Mr. Speaker, this year. I don't know where he was. Such were his instincts and such were his understanding of the importance of that issue. I can tell him, Mr. Speaker, that actually his figures are quite wrong. That before April we'd helped 1,400 people to safety from Afghanistan under the ARAP scheme since April. In April and August the 14th, we helped a further 2,000, and then, as he knows very well, Mr. Speaker, between August the 14th and August the 28th, this country performed an absolutely astonishing feat and yes, of course. Yes, of course, Mr. Speaker, we are going to do everything we can to help those who wish to have a safe passage out of Afghanistan. And that is why we will continue with our international friends and partners to apply whatever pressure we can, economic, diplomatic, on the Taliban to ensure that they comply with that, Mr. Speaker, as they have said that they will. But, Mr. Speaker, I think the right honourable gentleman should, in all candour, acknowledge the immensity of the achievement of the armed forces of this country in planning and preparing for months for Operation Pitting, Mr. Speaker, and then, Mr. Speaker, contrary to what he has just said, extracting almost double the number that they are originally preparing to do. It is a quite astonishing feat. It is a quite astonishing military and logistic feat, and one thing I welcome, Mr. Speaker, one thing I welcome is his congratulations to the armed forces for what they did.
Tobias Elwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Veterans and families, indeed the wider public, are asking what was it all for? The country is back in the hands of a dictatorship, terrorism is once again allowed to thrive, and the people of Afghanistan now face humanitarian disaster. More worryingly, the limits of the UK and Western influence have been exposed, and with America now adopting a more isolationist foreign policy, we have passed the high watermark of Western liberalism that began after the Second World War. This is a dangerous geopolitical turning point. I ask the Prime Minister, would he agree there is now a void of leadership in the West and NATO? And if Britain wants to fill that void, as we should do, it will require a complete overhaul of Whitehall to upgrade our strategic thinking, our foreign policy output, and our ability to lead.
Mr. Speaker, my right honourable friend deserves to be listened to with great respect on Afghanistan, and for his service. He understands these issues deeply, but I must tell him that I think people listening to this debate across the country could be forgiven for not recognising that this country actually ceased military operations in Afghanistan in 2014. And what we are doing now is making sure that we work with our friends and partners around the world to prevent Afghanistan from relapsing into a breeding ground for terror, to make sure that we use all the levers that we can to ensure that the rights of women and girls are respected, and that everybody who wants safe passage out of Afghanistan is allowed to do that. That is what we're going to do, and we will continue to show the leadership that we have in the G7, in the P5, in NATO, and all the other forums in which this country leads the West.
Ian Blackford, the leader of the SNP.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I thank all those that assisted in the evacuation from Afghanistan over the last few weeks, and can I thank the Prime Minister for an advance copy of his statement. Mr. Speaker, normally we have a Cabinet Minister sent to the House to cover for the Prime Minister, but today we have before us the Prime Minister desperately trying to cover for a Foreign Secretary who should have been sacked weeks ago. During committee last week, the Foreign Secretary failed to answer even basic questions from my honourable friend, the member for Glasgow South. I genuinely hope that the Prime Minister is better prepared today. Mr Speaker, there is barely an MP in this House who hasn't submitted urgent and sensitive information to the Foreign Office on UK and Afghan nationals desperate to find safe passage away from the Taliban. It is a disgrace that most of these urgent queries have been left unresolved and unanswered. A disgrace not for us, but for all those who have been left behind, UK and Afghan nationals, who are now fearful and in many cases in hiding. Thousands of desperate people, people we have a debt of responsibility to, have been left with no clarity, no answers and no help. So let me ask the Prime Minister, what assessment has been made of the number of UK nationals left in Afghanistan, and what plans are there to assist them? How many Afghans that qualify under the Arab scheme as interpreters or in other groups who have been left behind? And will the Prime Minister apologise to those who have been left behind, left high and dry, those that the UK has a responsibility to? Last night, in correspondence from Lord Ahmed, the government gave the excuse that delays in evacuating all those with rights were because the Foreign Office had received more correspondence than during COVID. But, Mr Speaker, there is a fundamental difference. No one knew COVID was coming. The government had 18 months to prepare an exit strategy in Afghanistan. So can the Prime Minister give a firm deadline when the massive backlog of applications will be processed and provide a new target date for when safe passage will be offered to those UK and Afghan citizens? When Parliament was recalled, the Prime Minister publicly agreed to hold a four-nation summit on the UK's responsibility to welcome refugees here. Can I ask the Prime Minister to give us the date when that summit will take place? And finally, with all the talk of cabinet reshuffle, can the Prime Minister guarantee that the Foreign Secretary will finally be sacked in any reshuffle? Or does he intend to reward incompetence?
Always, Mr Speaker, happy to meet representatives of the Scottish Government and other devolved administrations, of course, Mr Speaker. But he asked some specific questions about the handling of requests from those still in Afghanistan. And those who've been interceding on their behalf. I can tell him that by close of play today, every single one of the emails from colleagues around this House will be answered. Thousands and thousands have already been done. And as for the question, Mr Speaker, of how many Arab candidates are remaining, I can tell him that the total number is 311, of which 192 responded to the calls that were put out. And I repeat, Mr Speaker, we will do absolutely everything we can to ensure that those people get the safe passage that they deserve, using the levers that I have described. But nothing, but the contrast, Mr Speaker, should be readily apparent to everybody in this country, with the huge number, 15,000 people, that we were able to help just in the course of those few days in August. And I think people will understand that it was a very considerable effort by our armed forces.
Just to help the House, we'll be running this to around 4:45. Not everybody's going to get in. People will be disappointed, but we're going to do our best. So let's help each other. Theresa May.
I join my right honourable friend in commending all those involved with the Afghanistan airlift, and also all those of our armed forces who served in Afghanistan, sadly 457 of whom, as we know, paid the ultimate sacrifice. We should all be proud of their achievements. Does my right honourable friend agree that as a result of NATO forces withdrawing from Afghanistan, the terrorist threat has increased? And will he confirm that all those involved in counter-terrorism work here in the UK will be given the necessary support to ensure they can keep us safe?
Thank my right honourable friend, and I know how much work she has done in her career to protect this country and to assist in counter-terrorism. Mr Speaker, I can give her note that we have no direct information as yet of any increase to to the threat, Mr. Speaker, but I can assure her and the House that every effort will be made to make sure that our counter-terrorist agents have the resources they need to keep us safe.
David.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've received hundreds of emails from constituents about Afghanistan, and I have British nationals in Afghanistan, a husband and his pregnant wife. Can the Prime Minister say what discussions the government has had with Afghanistan neighbours about keeping borders open for those at risk under the Taliban and to support refugees?
Prime Minister.
Thank you very much, and I'm sure that many colleagues around the House will be asking similar questions. I can tell her that my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, has been talking to the government in Pakistan and other regional countries about what we can do to assist them, as I've described. And as she knows, we have, in addition to the ARAP programme, we have the Afghan settlement programme running up to 20,000 over the next few years.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I first of all pay tribute to the Prime Minister for his increased funding towards mental health care for veterans, and I'm sure he's going to keep that sum under review should it need to rise. May I ask him, however, if he'll draw the lesson that he's already learnt from the appointment of our right honourable friend, the member for Louth and Horncastle, in having a single point of contact in the UK, and seek to have a single point of contact for those in Afghanistan who may need to access either the route of exit or support from Her Majesty's government.
Prime Minister.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable gentleman. He knows whereof he speaks, and I've met people who've come from Afghanistan only recently who have helped us greatly in the last 20 years, and the key issues for them, as the House will understand, are where are they going to send their children to school, can they get access to the housing they need. I want to thank my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government, for what he is doing, and he is quite right, Mr. Speaker, that my honourable friend, the member for Louth and Horncastle, is the single point of contact that they should focus upon.
David.
Mr. Speaker, we all saw the horrific carnage outside Kabul airport. Over 180 people killed. So I join the Prime Minister in remembering all those victims, not least the 2 British nationals and the child of a British national. That airport atrocity was the work of the terrorist organisation ISIS-K. Everyone agrees we must now work to stop ISIS-K becoming a threat to the British people. Yet under this Prime Minister's watch, not only has he failed to agree an international coordinated strategy to take on ISIS-K, he has even failed to prescribe ISIS-K as a terrorist organisation unlike other Five Eyes countries. Will the Prime Minister explain these failures on national security?
I'm afraid the right honourable gentleman is in error. ISIS-K, ISIS Khorasan province, is a subset of Daesh. It's part of Daesh, and as he knows very well, one of the bitter ironies of the situation is, of course, that the Taliban themselves are no friends to ISIS-K, and whatever government there is in Kabul will need help fighting them.
Jacob.
Speaker, we are proving our immense generosity by supporting those in dire need in Afghanistan with safe passage to the UK. But our ability to do so is strained by the continuing uncontrolled illegal migration on the English Channel. What more can the government do to prevent it?
My honourable friend is completely right, and of course the issue is that very sadly, I think our friends across the Channel in France are faced with a very difficult problem of large numbers of people who want to come to this country, and we are doing everything that we can to encourage the French to do the necessary and impede their passage. But I know that my right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, is working round the clock to ensure that we not only encourage the French to stiffen their sinews and stop people making the journey, but we use every possible tactic that is available to us as well.
John MacDonald.
Could I ask the Prime Minister, raise a constituency matter with the Prime Minister? I've had over 800 Afghani local families contact me about their concerns about their relatives in Afghanistan, and we now have the thousands that are coming to this country, largely coming through Heathrow, and being quarantined in about 7 hotels in my constituency. there's a real anxiety that on past performance of what's happened with asylum seekers in hotels in our constituency, they could be trapped in those hotels for quite a long time to come. What I'd like the Minister to arrange is for a meeting with myself and the relevant minister or officials to discuss the plan for the support for those families, because I welcome, like everybody else, and my community does too, the support for those families, but also the long-term relocation plan to make sure that they have all that they can to settle here for the future.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, the right honourable gentleman is right to draw attention to the issue. Some councils have responded magnificently, notably in the East Midlands and elsewhere. I know that my right honourable friend is putting, for CLG, is putting substantial funding in place, Mr. Speaker. But if he wants a further meeting, I have no doubt that the relevant minister will be only too happy to oblige.
Siobhan Ben.
Mr. Speaker, I am working with incredible Stroud constituents who are dedicating their time to helping Afghan families under threat. These people are in hiding, the Taliban have been going door to door looking for them, border options are dangerous and constantly changing, they are absolutely terrified. Prime Minister, will you ensure and help me to show these families that they should not lose hope and help us as MPs provide timely and credible information about safe passage options?
Yes, of course, Mr. Speaker, and my honourable friend is entirely right in what she says, but that is why we're going to continue to put all the pressure that we can on the Taliban to ensure safe passage for the groups that I have described, and we're joined in that by friends and partners around the world.
Super.
I join with the tribute to our armed forces who have worked so hard. There are still people being persecuted and hunted by the Taliban because they worked for the UK government, but through contractors, not as direct employees. And they haven't had replies to their ARAP applications, and the rumour circulating is that they may have to wait for the resettlement scheme, but also that the places on the resettlement scheme many of them have already been allocated and that the scheme is almost full. Could he clarify the situation for those people? Also tell us whether some of the resettlement scheme places have been pre-allocated, and if so, how many? And say what will be done for those contractors as well as direct employees who we owe an obligation to.
No, I'm very grateful to the right honourable lady, and she raises an important question. I can tell her that the ARAP places, as it were, have not been transferred. They continue to be valid. People on ARAP scheme continue to be eligible, and nor is it correct, Mr. Speaker, to say that the initial budget of 5,000 for the resettlement scheme has already been filled. That is not correct either.
Walter Julian.
Mr. Speaker, the Council for At-Risk Academics has been rescuing scholars in danger from oppressive regimes since the Nazi period in 1933. The Home Office has been sent a list of 12 such scholars, some of whom are in hiding in Afghanistan, some in hiding in Pakistan for lack of documentation. Will the Home Office make their case a priority because in them lies any hope for the future of Afghanistan?
Yes, well, there are many difficult cases, Mr. Speaker, but my right honourable friend is very... I thank him for drawing attention to these particular individuals who are at risk, and I'll ensure that the relevant Foreign Office Minister is in touch with him about the specific cases that he raises.
Rachel Baston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We know that the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan and the region is growing by the hour. The famine is expected, and of course aid is going to be difficult to get through. So what specific steps has he taken already to ensure that that famine is averted, but also the region receive the international development aid it requires in order to avert a further crisis?
Right. I talked immediately, Mr. Speaker. I talked immediately that the crisis broke to UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres about what the UN should be doing, what the UK was going to do to support. And as she knows, the UN continues to be in country in Afghanistan, and we've doubled our humanitarian support, and we'll be working with friends and partners at UNGA and beyond to ensure that we tackle the humanitarian crisis as well.
Andrew Mitchell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Certainly the last months has seen the shattering of many illusions, but does my right honourable friend agree that if we are tonight to help the people of Afghanistan, millions of whom are out in the open and will not be fed, we need to make sure that the whole international community focuses on doing so through the mechanism of the United Nations and probably through the traditional mechanism of a regional contact group, and that Britain, through its experience on these matters, through its membership of the UN Security Council, through its G7 chairmanship, is now in a pivotal position to help those people I mentioned.
My right honourable friend is completely right to raise the contact group in addition to the other forums that I have described, and to pay particular note to the role of the UN. And I know that my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, has just talked to Jean Arnaud, the UN Secretary General's special representative to Afghanistan. I think that the contact group is a vital part of the way we should coordinate our efforts.
Patricia Gibson.
Mr. Speaker, 80% of the world's heroin and opium supply originates in Afghanistan, providing the Taliban with more than half its income and causing untold misery across the world. For the future, what steps is he taking in partnership with UK allies to prevent the Taliban and the organised criminal gangs they work with from flooding our communities with yet more heroin, given they are now in control in Afghanistan and have fewer impediments than ever to growing more opium?
Sadly, Mr. Speaker, the rate of production and export of heroin, of opium from Afghanistan has been increasing in recent years, and I think the figure is actually even higher now in terms of global output than the one that the Honourable Lady suggests. And what is needed is, of course, to insist that the Taliban stop this, that they don't allow Afghanistan to continue to be a narco state. But the way to fight heroin consumption in this country is to have a strong crime-fighting institution such as the National Crime Agency. I was privileged to see the work of our United Kingdom's crime fighters doing fantastic work near Glasgow.
Steve Double.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister will be aware that as a result of the NATO withdrawal from Afghanistan, there is great concern that the terrorist threat to this country has increased. So can he reassure the people of this country that we maintain not only the military capability but also the political will to take whatever action is necessary against groups like ISIS-K to keep this country safe?
My honourable friend makes an extremely important point, a question that I think a lot of people will have formed in their minds, and I know my right honourable friend, the Defence Secretary, has answered this before, but of course we keep those options on the table, and of course the Taliban are aware of that.
Dave Meghill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there are many barriers facing people already in the immigration system coming through. One is that some of my constituents have spouses and children whose original documents are with the Home Office and they only have photocopies. And another, of course, is the English language test. Is he and the Home Secretary proposing any movement on those issues in order to support people, particularly those already in the system, to get here as quickly as possible?
Yes, I thank the Right Honourable Lady, and she should know that, of course, we try to help people coming from Afghanistan in the most expeditious way possible. And I think, really, this country cannot be faulted for the generosity of our offer on the resettlement programme, and it certainly cannot be faulted, Mr. Speaker, for the sheer number of people we've moved already to this country.
Logan.
Mr. Speaker, and I welcome the Prime Minister's statements. Aside from the G7 and traditional partners that the Prime Minister referred to, in the months and years ahead in the region in Central Asia, along with Pakistan, Uzbekistan, and in particular with China, what role does he envisage these countries playing in the geopolitics of the region?
Mr. Speaker, my friend asked a very, very important question, but I think the answer to that question is it is in the interest of every single one of the countries he has just mentioned to ensure that Afghanistan does not relapse into being a breeding ground for terror. Mr. Speaker, it is not in China's interest, it is not in Uzbekistan's interest, it is not in Russia's interest. Russia has abundant experience, Mr. Speaker, of the risks of Afghanistan. And that's why it's so important that we work with friends and partners around the world, and indeed those who aren't ordinarily classified as our friends, to achieve a common perspective on the pressure we've got to apply to the Taliban.
Ellen Hayes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many of my constituents have family members in Afghanistan who could be eligible for asylum in the UK under more than one route, for example via ARAP or under the Foreign Office Special Cases criteria or under family reunion. Yet there is currently no coordination between departments. My constituents are being passed from pillar to post. ARAP are refusing cases where there may be an alternative route, and the Foreign Secretary and the Home Secretary are not replying to their emails. When will the Prime Minister sort out this lack of coordination across his government?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I must reject that in the strongest possible terms, because I want to pay. Because the House has paid tribute, quite rightly, Mr. Speaker, to the work of the armed services over the last few weeks and months. But I think they should also pay tribute to the Foreign Common and Development Office, a rapid reaction team who went out to Afghanistan. They should pay tribute to the Border Force, officials who went out there and who worked hand in glove to help thousands of people come to this country in safety.
Mark Harper.
Mr. Speaker, in terms of protecting our country, now that the risk from terrorists has undoubtedly increased, what is the Prime Minister's assessment, not just of the Taliban's willingness to deal with terrorists operating in Afghanistan, but actually their capability to deal with that terrorist threat, given what we saw from ISIS-K just a week or so ago?
My right honourable friend is right to draw attention to the risks that the Taliban are themselves running, because they now possess the government of Afghanistan, and it is their responsibility, and they clearly face that threat from ISK and indeed potentially other groups. And of course, they will do everything, I imagine, to protect the public. But in the end, Mr. Speaker, we have to face the reality that the Taliban have now got the problem. We will do everything we can, of course, to ensure that we guard against future outbreaks of terrorism from that country, but it is in the interest of the new government of Afghanistan to crack down on terrorism as much as anybody else.
Sybil Roberts.
Under the Nationality and Borders Bill, an Afghan woman who flees with her children and arrives in Britain by an irregular route won't be welcomed. She'll be criminalised. Yep. Wales has declared our role in the world to be as a nation of sanctuary. Will he withdraw the Borders Bill to enable us to fulfil our ambition and to make that warm welcome he spoke about?
No, I can't accept what the honourable lady has said, because this country has been extremely generous, more generous than most countries around the world, not just in bringing people immediately from Afghanistan, but in setting out a safe and legal route for 20,000 more to come. And that is a big number, and the route for those people is clear.
Mr.
Speaker, I'm very pleased to hear about the Operation Warm Welcome, and Wiltshire, my county, is home to many thousands of British soldiers who have served with Afghan colleagues over the last 20 years. And I hope the Prime Minister will join me in congratulating Wiltshire Council and the communities of Wiltshire, including the military communities, for the welcome that they are offering to those refugees. And will he assure the House that councils across the country will get the resources they need to support those evacuees?
Yes, I thank him, and of course I congratulate Wiltshire Council for what they are doing, as I congratulate all councils who are stepping up to the plate and helping Afghans to settle and to integrate at this time. But what I can tell him is that Wiltshire Council and all other councils involved will get the support and funding they need.
Richard Bergen.
Like other members, my constituency office and I have been doing everything we can to help constituents trapped in Afghanistan and to help their relatives who need to get out urgently. But it's clear that the government is failing to do all it can to help these vulnerable people and is disgracefully putting even more people's lives at risk. More widely, President Biden has called for an end to an era of major military operations to remake other countries. Given the huge loss of life in the disastrous and tragic wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya and elsewhere, isn't it time that we do the same?
Mr. Speaker, as I've just reminded the House, the UK ended its military operation in Afghanistan in 2014.
Anthony Magnan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I ask the Prime Minister what engagement he has had with NGOs, which are the only Western organisations that are still on the ground in Afghanistan, he and the Foreign Secretary have had, and what steps he will take to protect them? And can I also ask what parameters need to be met to see the embassy reopened? The British diplomatic network is one of the finest in the world. That is surely the way to be able to help those who have been left behind.
My honourable friend is entirely right to draw attention to the incredible work done by aid agencies, by NGOs, and it's precisely to support those fantastic agencies that we've doubled our humanitarian aid to Afghanistan, to the region, to £286 million this year.
Dan Jarvis.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Later today, I'll be reunited with an Afghan Special Forces commander that I had the privilege of serving alongside. He's mightily relieved to be here, but understandably deeply concerned about the hundreds of his men and their family members who, although approved for relocation to the UK, were left behind. What can I tell him is being done to ensure that those who are in limbo are afforded safe passage, protection and unimpeded access to the UK?
Hear.
Mr. Speaker, I want to pay tribute to the service of the honourable gentleman opposite, and in addition to the service of the Afghan Special Forces, and he's absolutely right to draw attention to what they did. I believe the 333, the triples, were incredibly important, and we will do whatever we can, Mr. Speaker, as I've said, to ensure that those who have not yet come out do get the safe passage they need.
Johnny Mercer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister just said from the dispatch box, no veterans' call for help will go unanswered, and I totally support that ambition. In fact, that was a central aim of the establishment of the Office for Veterans Affairs when he started. But he knows, and I know, that he has consistently failed to take the measures required to make that a reality for veterans in communities like mine. What is he going to do differently to make veterans feel like this change and not just read about it in the newspapers or hear about it from Westminster?
I thank my honourable friend for the work that he did as Minister for Veterans Affairs, and indeed for his service in Afghanistan. And I believe that he underestimates what this gravely underestimates what this country has done. And just today on veterans' mental health, Mr. Speaker, the House will have heard the further support that we're offering. But this is a government that is absolutely determined to support our veterans, and that's why we passed the Overseas Operations Bill and will continue to take steps to protect the veterans of this country.
Benra Pongasari.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have cases involving over 300 people who are still stranded in Afghanistan, and despite raising every case with the FCDO and the Home Office, I'm yet to receive a substantial response. Not one. My constituents are desperate for information on how to travel to third countries and when the full resettlement scheme will be launched. Will the Prime Minister meet with me to discuss these urgent cases and promise that every email will receive a proper response from the relevant department?
I thank her. I expect that she speaks for many colleagues around the House who like me, who will have received messages from those who wish to leave Afghanistan. But I just repeat what I said earlier on, Mr. Speaker, that every single email from colleagues is being responded to by close of play today.
Peter Byrne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And like many members, I've had emails from Afghans in this country worried about their people back in Afghanistan. And the Home Office and the Foreign Office have managed to get some of those people relocated. But I had the extraordinary situation, sir, where I had an email, a very detailed email, about these Afghans who had been persecuted, who had worked for the British, and it was very detailed, and they produced all the documentation. Then the following day, my constituent wrote to me and said, "I'm really sorry. It's a complete lie. These people are Taliban, and I can't go through with this masquerade." I just wonder, sir, whether we should be on guard against getting such people into this country.
my honourable friend will be relieved, I'm sure, like many people in this House, to know that from the very beginning of pitting and the Arab scheme and all the subsequent schemes that we've put in place, the very highest possible security checks have been instituted to make sure that people are who they say they are and that we receive to this country the people who genuinely deserve to come here.
Stephen Furry.
Mr. Speaker, can the Prime Minister clarify the current situation that applies to those Afghans who were in this country and in our asylum system prior to the fall of Kabul? Will they too be given indefinite leave to remain? And surely there is no circumstances in which they would be forced to return to Afghanistan?
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful you raised an important point, but many of these individuals will already be going through procedures in the courts, and we can't interrupt them, so those will go on.
David Davis.
The whole House agreed with the Prime Minister when he celebrated the heroism of our troops, but that simply served to crystallise that this was not so much a defeat as a capitulation, an abandonment by the West of both people and principle. Can I ask the Prime Minister whether he believes Tony Blair was right this morning when he said the Western leadership was naive to believe that countries could be remade? Or was it that our remaking of Afghanistan needed to last longer?
Well, if Mr. Blair, Tony Blair, was saying that it was naive to believe that countries could be remade, Mr. Speaker, and he was thinking of some of the things that he supported, then I think he was spot on.
Tony Lloyd.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I say to the Prime Minister, he will know that after the calamitous collapse of the government in Kabul, the disorderly retreat by Western powers, that there was rejoicing in parts of Mozambique, across the Sahel, and of course in Somalia. Those are countries in which we have an interest because, if nothing else, they can be a source of terrorism here. What messages is he prepared now to give about the UK, but about the UK working with partners to guarantee that there is a proper response, a measured response that will make sure that we are not at risk of terrorism?
Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman is focusing on exactly the right question and on exactly the right response from the Western world and indeed the whole global community. We need to work together to ensure that as far as we possibly can, we condition the new government, new authorities in Kabul to understand that Afghanistan can't just slide back into being a cesspit of terror, and that's our effort today.
Richard Drax.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many lessons will have been learnt and relearnt from Afghanistan, not least the need for boots on the ground. With the US becoming more isolated, will my right honourable friend look again at the disastrous plan to reduce the army by 10,000?
Mr. Speaker, we are very proud of what we've done since this government came in to increase the size of our defence commitments to the biggest, by the biggest amount since the end of the Cold War. And on his point about Afghanistan, I think that the reality is that even when there were 130,000 Western troops in Afghanistan, it was not possible to subjugate the Taliban, and I'm afraid that we're living with the lessons of that today.
Line Lucas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Last Friday, through tears, a young Afghan constituent told me how his father, a British citizen, was turned away from the Baron Hotel in Kabul on the 28th of August. His father was trying to evacuate his other children, but he was refused permission to take two of them out of the country because they were aged 18 and 19. Can the Prime Minister imagine the pain of that kind of family separation? So all of them have stayed in Kabul at huge risk to themselves. Will he look again at the rules of family reunification and finally make it possible for families to stay together and not to have to face this terrible, terrible choice?
Well, Mrs. Speaker, I know the whole House will be full of sympathy to the family that she describes and the heartbreak that they must have felt, and I'm sure there are many cases in Kabul right now. But I think that the record of this country in receiving people and being prepared to receive people in the future is very good. And can I ask that in case of the particular family that she's talking about, can I ask her please to write to me or to the Home Secretary directly?
Caroline Noakes.
Many constituents have understandably been in touch, desperately worried about family members in Afghanistan. They want to find out whether the Afghan Citizen Resettlement Scheme will be an application or an allocation process, when it will open, and what that process will look like.
I thank the Right Honourable Lady. We'll be making sure that there is a process by which people can apply, but there is clearly a ceiling in the first year of 5,000, then it goes up to 20,000 over the next few years.
John Chorley.
Speaker. Christians in Afghanistan are one of the many minorities facing persecution, and many have been forced to flee their homes. A church community in my constituency is working around the clock to support several Christian families to flee to Pakistan and to seek asylum at the embassy of a safe third country. They're not looking for asylum in the UK, but they're looking to get to Pakistan. So what particular support will his government offer vulnerable Christians, such as those that the community in my constituency are working with? And to which department should I direct my entreaties in the hope of actually getting an answer?
I thank the community, the church community that she describes, for the work that they are doing, and in moving people to Pakistan, the government is helping by increasing the funding available, and much of which obviously already goes to Pakistan, and that's the purpose of the increase in the aid budget this year.
Liam Fox.
Even if we believe that the whole Afghanistan withdrawal was a US-made policy that was ill-judged and poorly executed, can I ask my right honourable friend to reject those voices calling for the United Kingdom to pull back from the United States and seek alternative alliances elsewhere? Surely the right response is to stick closely to our US friends, remind them that in the era of globalisation our economic and security interests will be threatened beyond our borders, that the United States is a force for good in the world, and that greater isolationism can only put us all in greater danger.
Mr. Speaker, we helped 36 countries to repatriate their nationals or those that they had helped, but we could not have done it, Mr. Speaker, had it not been for the bravery of the US military and the commitment of the US military. And I passionately agree with what he has just said about the fundamental importance of our alliance with the United States of America.
Imran Hussain.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government leaving vulnerable Afghans and British nationals behind is unforgivable. But what is completely and utterly reprehensible is that the families of two of my constituents, including a 7-month-old child, were forcibly removed from flights and thrown out of Kabul airport onto the streets where the scene of the horrific suicide bombing hours before. Mr. Speaker, I am absolutely furious, and I want to ask the Prime Minister, how on earth was this potentially fatal decision allowed to happen, even after I raised these matters with ministers sat to his left and his right? And how many others were ejected from the airport into harm's way? And just what does he have to say to the families that the government has now put in grave danger?
I thank him very much, Mr. Speaker, for raising the case. I have to tell him that I'm told we have no evidence of anybody being pulled off flights, but I would ask him, obviously, Mr. Speaker, I would ask him to raise it with raise the particular cases directly with my right honourable friends beside me. But I can tell him I think that when he looks at the overall record of the UK in moving people out of Kabul and across the whole of Afghanistan, it was an astonishing feat.
Ian Duncan.
Mr. Speaker, I thank my right honourable friend for his statement. Can I ask whether or not he's noticed that the Chinese government, since our departure from Afghanistan, has used Afghanistan to up its threats on Taiwan with hundreds of overflights, threatening them and telling them when the war comes, the US will not be there to support them? Could my right honourable friend take this opportunity from the dispatch box to say to the Taiwanese and others, we fully support their right to democracy, self-determination, and we will be there to support them no matter what the Chinese say, and could we persuade the Americans to do the same?
Mr. Speaker, I thank my right honourable friend, and I'm of course aware of the continuing issues between the People's Republic of China and Taiwan, and I've discussed that indeed recently with the President of the United States, and it's one of the reasons why it's absolutely vital that this country continues to insist on the primacy of our relationship with the United States, and the situation in Taiwan will continue to be difficult, and the House should understand it will. The only answer, the only way forward, is to continue to support American global leadership, and that is what we will do.
Thank you,
Mr. Speaker. As the Prime Minister knows, NGOs such as the excellent Kent Refugee Action Network provide vital support to those fleeing from conflict, and as he mentioned, that's via fundraising. But does he also acknowledge that the state has a duty of care regarding the mental health of traumatised refugees, including children? And if he does, how can he assure the House that this will be possible, given that the average wait for young people waiting just a basic mental health assessment is on average 2 to 3 years currently?
I thank her, but I can tell her that the government is absolutely determined to look after people coming from Afghanistan, and in particular look after their mental health or the trauma that they have suffered, and that's why we are investing massively in the services that are being provided not just by CLG but by local government across the board.
Can I ask the Prime Minister, please, what extra funds are going to be made available for local councils and schools like the Derbyshire Dales District Council, who urgently want to help but want to make sure there are funds, additional funds available?
I thank her, and I thank Derbyshire Dales District Council for stepping up, Mr. Speaker. And yes, of course, we will make sure that the funds are available. And she should make representations to my honourable friend, member for Louth and Horncastle.
Chris Law.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister's handling of the planned departure from Afghanistan, for those of us who are old enough in here, is akin to one of the farcical characters in Carry On Up the Khyber. Foreign Secretary was on a beach as the Taliban advanced in Kabul. Unknown numbers of British nationals remain left behind, and the Taliban, and most probably ISIS, have been allowed to plunder military hardware and intelligence. Does the Prime Minister accept any responsibility, any personal responsibility, for the message being left in Afghanistan, and does he agree that any notion of global Britain is in complete crisis?
No, Mr. Speaker, and he's wrong in every respect, including, by the way, Mr. Speaker, he's wrong in what he says about military hardware, because that was decommissioned.
Manchester.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister has said we should judge the Taliban by their actions, not their words. The Taliban in Afghanistan have said they will confine and operate within the rules of Islam. As somebody who comes from a Muslim background, whose father is an imam, whose grandfather's an imam, whose uncles were imams, I'm not an expert on Islam. I have a good understanding of the faith. A way forward for the Prime Minister and government may be this. If the Prime Minister were to use his kind offices and ask the OIC, the Organisation of Islamic Cooperation, 57 member states, to ask the Al-Azhar, leading Islamic school of thought, to set out what it means with regards to and what Islam stands for women and religious minorities. And that may give us a way to judge, to see what the Taliban are doing and what Islam stands for.
Prime Minister.
I think my honourable friend is making a very interesting suggestion, and I hope that it will be, I hope it, well, I encourage it to be taken up. But what we need to do is to make sure that those elements of the Taliban who are different, and I believe they are, who are different from the Taliban of 1996, are encouraged, and that we put the maximum pressure on them not to allow the more retrograde elements to have the upper hand. And that is what this government and other governments around the world are going to do.
Ben.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. Many communities, the City of Leeds included, have always given a very warm welcome to refugees, but we know that the poorest parts of our country have consistently taken a much higher proportion of refugees and asylum seekers than the wealthier areas. Does the Prime Minister think that is fair? And if not,
What does he intend to do about it?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I believe the whole country should pull together and everybody should step up to the plate. And I know that there are councils across the country that will want to help and are helping. I thank the people of Leeds very much for what they've done, both now and historically, and I hope that councils around the world will follow their example, around the UK will follow their example.
An objection.
Can I thank my right honourable friend for his statement, in which he refers to the fact that Saturday is the 20th anniversary of 9/11. And given that public confidence has taken quite a bashing from this episode in the government's strategic thinking, is it not now time for a cold, hard, strategic look at how well we have done over the last 20 years? What has gone well, the mistakes we have made, what we have learned, and what should be implemented to implement those lessons? Will he undertake to make sure that reflection takes place?
Prime Minister.
Yes. I'm grateful to my right honourable friend. I think the best I can do is direct him once again to the integrated review, which I know that he has studied and I believe is now more relevant than ever.
Jim Shannon.
I thank the Prime Minister for his statement today. Is the Prime Minister aware that there is a desire within industry to help provide refugees with housing and jobs? Two firms in my constituency, for instance, Waterbrook Foods and Master Direct, are very keen and willing to give the jobs to the Afghanis and are also have the access to private housing. Goodness always shines through, Prime Minister, and I think that's something we should always remember. What steps can the Prime Minister give via the Treasury to help assist and incentivise firms who want to help those who served alongside British forces and whose lives are at risk for their commitment to freedom and democracy in Afghanistan? Thank you.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman makes an incredibly important point, because the labour market is full of vacancies at the moment, and there are obviously opportunities for hard-working people of talent and energy to come and make their lives across the whole of the UK, and we will help them with training, with the English language, and, as I've been saying, with what else they need.
Lynn Marston.
In stark contrast with the Leader of the Opposition, whose definition of leadership seems to be silence followed by 2020 hindsight, I commend the Prime Minister for his leadership in this crisis, and I ask him to continue that, both on behalf of the UK and the G7, for women and girls in Afghanistan, both for their education and for their wider participation in Afghan society.
I thank my honourable friend, and I think, and I have to say, I think that the UK, together with our German friends, our Italian friends, our French friends, our American friends, are pulling together with all our G7 colleagues and others, are pulling together to forge a collective global view as far as we possibly can about how to deal with the new regime in Kabul. And it's by working together that we will get the best results. And the UK, as the whole House knows, is in pole position in all the key institutions, and we will continue to exercise that role.
Jeremy Corbyn.
I realise the government's focus at the moment is on refugees and dealing with the immediate crisis. But does he not think that with tens of thousands of Afghan dead, thousands of American dead, hundreds of British dead, it is time for a full inquiry into the whole process that led us into Afghanistan and the whole notion of a foreign policy in which we intervene all over the world and start to re-examine our place and our role in this world?
Prime Minister.
The right honourable gentleman knows, because he's heard me say it before, that there was a full review after the extraction, after the end of the military operation in 2014, a review of what it achieved and the legacy of those brave British men and women who served in Afghanistan. I think that was the right thing to do. As for the rest, I don't know whether he's read the integrated review from cover to cover, Mr. Speaker, but I direct him to it.
Andrew Bridgen.
Following our ignominious withdrawal from Afghanistan, where effectively we were dragged out on the coattails of our more powerful American allies, the world has changed, Mr. Speaker, and the world has become a more dangerous place. Would my right honourable friend share with the House his latest assessment of the so-called special relationship? And isn't it time for another defence review?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable friend. And his trenchant views I often agree with, but I think in this case the special relationship is basically, Mr. Speaker, I think I called it at Carbis Bay the irreplaceable or the indestructible relationship. I can't remember exactly what phrase I used, but that is what it is. It is a basic geopolitical fact, and on the special relationship rests much of the security of the last 100 years, and it will continue to be of cardinal importance to this country, and that is a fact that is as understood in Washington as it is in this country.
Into Kyle.
The Prime Minister has turned his back on the EU. The Washington has turned its back on him. Can you tell us, since he became Prime Minister and stood on a platform of global Britain, where does Britain have more influence than before he became Prime Minister?
Prime Minister.
I'm delighted to say, Mr. Speaker, that thanks to virtually everywhere is the answer to that, Mr. Speaker. But across the because we are able. We not only have our own sanctions policy, Mr. Speaker. We've been able to set up embassies and legations, new ones around the world, in the South Pacific, in Africa. Where we are opening up, Mr. Speaker, and Mr. Speaker, we are doing free trade deals. I think a total of 63 so far, Mr. Speaker. And who knows? Maybe there'll even be another one this week, Mr. Speaker.
That's it.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the Prime Minister will be aware, that the majority of people who came to this country from Afghanistan came via Birmingham Airport to my constituency. Will my right honourable friend join me in commending the team at Birmingham Airport, Solihull Council, third sector organisations like Entrade at Three Trees Community Centre, who welcome nearly 1,000 people a day, and sometimes many, many children and young babies?
Prime Minister.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. I had the opportunity to thank the troops the other day, but I want to thank everybody who's been involved, the border force officials, everybody in the councils who's been at the front line of dealing with this crisis. I think they've done it with exceptional humanity and compassion.
Ram.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've sent 143 Afghans who are connected with my constituency through to the Foreign Secretary and to the Defence Secretary and the Home Secretary. I got them on the wrong order, but anyway, all three of them, because there are three different channels. Can I just urge the Prime Minister to reflect on the idea that has been suggested by countless colleagues on this side, that there should be a single triage point, a single person that deals with all of these, because since I sent in those names, one of them has been shot, one has been raped, and one has been tortured. So people are desperate to try and get the best result for these people. I'm sure the ministers want to help, but at the moment it just feels as if the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing.
Mr. Speaker, I'm sure the whole House sympathises very much with what's happened to the individuals that he describes in Afghanistan, and we are doing our level best to help people as fast as we can. I want the government to focus on helping people with a single point of contact. That's why my honourable friend, the member for Louth and Horncastle, is the person in question.
Ms. Fox.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The men and women who serve in our armed forces are remarkable and make huge sacrifices both personally and in their careers. Can my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, confirm that they're going to get the very best of support and care when they return home, so that they know this nation is grateful for what they've done?
Prime Minister.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, it's absolutely vital that those who have given so much, who served so bravely in Afghanistan, and indeed their families, should receive the lifelong support that they deserve, and they will, Mr. Speaker.
Jessica.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My office and I have been trying for several years through the Home Office to reunite various Afghan interpreters who settled in Newport with their wives and families. And just hours before the withdrawal, their paperwork came through, but they weren't able to get through the crowds to flights. We understand they're not eligible for ARA, so does that mean they are included in the resettlement scheme? And what happens now, given the principle of them joining their husbands has been agreed?
I'm very grateful. I'm very sorry to hear what happened at Hamid Karzai International Airport. I hope that they will be successful under the resettlement scheme, and if she'd be kind enough to send details through to the Home Secretary, I'd be very grateful.
Jameson.
Mr. Speaker, it's very easy, of course, to apportion blame with the benefit of hindsight, but this is a really complex environment, and the current situation is as much a failure of leadership in Afghanistan as anything else. Whilst we may not want to engage with the Taliban, does the Prime Minister agree that we have no choice but to do so, and perhaps with a forward presence in Kabul in the same way that our Chinese and Russian adversaries have?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, if I may say so, my honourable friend is very wise in what he says. I believe that it is inevitable for us to engage with the Taliban, and indeed we have been. We are at the airport. British troops were working directly with their Taliban counterparts to ensure that the operation went through, and that was an inevitability, Mr. Speaker. And we will, of course, look at further cooperation, but as I said to the House, we will judge the new regime in Kabul not by what they say, but by what they do.
Right, Matt Fadden.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our troops did a great job at Kabul airport, but it's also the case that events of recent weeks have exposed the limitations of our ability to act out with the umbrella of the United States, even if we wanted to choose a different path. What is the Prime Minister's response to the exposure of those limitations?
Prime Minister.
I don't agree with what he said, because I think that the particular case of Afghanistan was one in which America was very much engaged because of 9/11. It was America that supplied 98% of the air power. The munitions dropped. 98% were from the US. It was overwhelmingly a US-led mission. But that doesn't mean that the UK cannot cooperate and will not cooperate with other friends and partners around the world. That is what we're going to continue to do.
James Ray.
167 occasions all told, I stood with the people of what's now Royal Witten Bassett to see 345 of our comrades repatriated to this country. On no occasion did I hear anybody say why. Nobody ever said these lives were wasted. Nobody was ever ashamed of what had happened. On the contrary, they were proud of the fact that these young people had given their lives for the service of their country and for the benefit of the people of Afghanistan and for the security of the world. Will the Prime Minister not agree with me that that should now be the litmus test as to how we judge what's happening in Afghanistan? We should be proud of all we've done.
Prime Minister.
I thank my right honourable friend. I believe he speaks for millions of people, quiet people, up and down this country.
Yes. Dan Abbott.
Prime Minister will be aware that the entire House is united in offering our respect and our congratulations to the people at the grassroots who made that evacuation of British passport holders and Afghans possible in recent weeks. But the Prime Minister must also be aware how difficult it has been to get responses from government departments on behalf of our constituents who are terrified about their relatives and want to arrange for safe passage for their relatives. Will the government give the House an undertaking that he will make sure that the relevant government departments have the resources, have the people, so we are able to communicate with our constituents and give them some news at least?
Prime Minister.
I thank her, and she's really repeating a point that's been made up and down across the House by many colleagues this afternoon. But I think that the work so far has been extraordinary. I pay tribute to the speed with which British officials have done their best to respond, and every email, as I said, Mr. Speaker, will be answered by tonight.
There's some didn't get in, and hopefully we can pick those up in the next statement from the Foreign Secretary. Call the Foreign Secretary.
I do like Don.
I'm going to wait. Go ahead. Mr. Speaker, with your permission, I will update the House on the UK's international response to the situation in Afghanistan. As my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, has set out, over the last 3 weeks, through shared effort right across government and our armed forces, we have delivered the largest and most complex evacuation in living memory. Between the 15th and the 29th of August, the UK evacuated over 15,000 people from Afghanistan. And that includes over 8,000 British nationals, close to 5,000 Afghans who loyally served the UK, along with their dependents, and around 500 special cases of particularly vulnerable Afghans, including achieving scholars, journalists, human rights defenders, campaigners for women's rights, judges and many others. Of course, the work to get people out didn't start on the 15th of August. The SCDO advised British nationals to leave the country in April and then again on the 6th of August. We estimate that around 500 did so. At the same time, the government launched the ARAP scheme for interpreters and other Afghan staff, getting over 1,900 out before the airlift began on the 15th of August. Now, as the security situation deteriorated, we accelerated that process throughout July and early August. In total, since April, we've helped over 17,000 people leave. And I want to place on record my thanks and pay tribute to the Herculean efforts of our troops, our diplomats, our civil servants, who have done an incredible job in the toughest of conditions. And as we remember their efforts, we also remember those of UK armed forces who paid the ultimate sacrifice in Afghanistan, trying to make that country a better place for the Afghan people. Mr. Speaker, now that the evacuation has ended, we have moved into a new phase. We stand by our commitment to support those who have worked for us and to take all remaining eligible cases. Securing their safe passage out of the country is an immediate priority. We're working through our diplomatic channels to that end. And of course, the Taliban have given assurances that they will provide safe passage for foreign nationals and those eligible Afghans who wish to leave. So on the 30th of August, the UN Security Council passed Resolution 2593, driven by the UK alongside the US and France, affirming the international community's expectation requirement that the Taliban should follow through on the assurances that they've given. Last week, I visited Qatar and Pakistan. In Qatar, I met with the Emir and their Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister, Sheikh Mohammed, to discuss safe passage alongside the international community's wider approach to dealing with the Taliban. We discussed ongoing efforts to re-establish flights at Kabul airport, where Qatari technical staff are working on the ground, and see how we can cooperate in handling the organisation of future flights. I also announced our new non-resident Chargé d'Affaires for Afghanistan, Martin Longdon, who is now working out of Doha. In Pakistan, I met with Prime Minister Khan and Foreign Minister Qureshi to discuss safe passage via third countries and the importance of holding the Taliban to its commitments. I also announced that we're sending £30 million of support to Afghanistan's neighbours. This will provide life-saving support for refugees, including shelters, household necessities, sanitation and other hygiene facilities. At the same time, I dispatched last week a new rapid deployment team to the region with an extra 22 staff in total. They will reinforce our embassy teams, our High Commission teams, in those neighbouring countries, processing British nationals or eligible Afghans who are seeking to leave via third countries, which we want to do just as fast as we possibly can once they can leave and subject to the necessary security checks. I also spoke to the Foreign Minister of Uzbekistan earlier today, the Foreign Minister of Tajikistan last week, and the Minister for South Asia, Lord Ahmed, last week visited Tajikistan and will return to the region shortly. Mr. Speaker, turning to the wider international strategy, the international community is adjusting, and it must adjust to the new reality in Afghanistan and recalibrate its approach. The UK is playing a leading role. My right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, convened G7 leaders on the 24th of August, to discuss a shared response to the situation. That followed a G7 Foreign Ministers meeting, and we are building a global coalition around 4 key priorities set out in a UK G7 paper that we've shared with those partners. First, we must prevent Afghanistan from ever becoming a safe haven or harbour for terrorists ever again. Second, we must prevent a humanitarian disaster and support refugees wherever possible in the region. The UK has allocated £286 million in aid for Afghanistan this year. We're supporting Afghanistan's neighbours, as I've already set out, and the Home Secretary has set out our resettlement scheme. So we are leading by example, which enables us to encourage others to step up in what will inevitably have to be an international team effort. Third, we must preserve regional stability, which risks being shattered by the combination of renewed terrorist threat and an exodus of refugees. Fourth, we must hold the Taliban and other factions to account for their conduct, including in particular on human rights and their treatment of women and girls. I'm taking this forward through our bilateral partners We have a G7 Plus meeting later this week, and the UK is also pressing for further discussions amongst the permanent members of the UN Security Council. We plan to host an event at the UN General Assembly later this month, as indicated by the Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, we will not recognise the Taliban, but we will engage, and we will carefully calibrate our actions to the choices that they make and the actions that they take. Given our strategic priorities, the ones that I've set out, we must also set some credible tests to hold the Taliban to the undertakings they have made on safe passage, on terrorism, on humanitarian access, and a more inclusive government. And we stand ready to use all the levers at our disposal in that effort, political, economic, and diplomatic. Mr. Speaker, we continue to galvanise the international community and bring together the widest possible group of influential countries to deliver on those strategic priorities and exercise the maximum moderating influence on the Taliban that we possibly can. And I commend the statement to the House.
Let's call Shadow Foreign Secretary Lisa Nandy.
Mr. Speaker, this has been a painful and sobering few weeks, and were it not for the heroic efforts of the armed forces, as well as the brave diplomats and civil servants involved in Operation Pitting, many more lives would have been lost and many more left behind. They reminded us what courage looks like, and I would like to put on record my thanks to them, to all of those who've served in Afghanistan over the last 2 decades, and to add my condolences to the families of all those killed in the horrific bombing at Kabul airport. But if more lives are not to be lost, we need some urgent clarity today. What specifically is the advice to people trying to leave? Should they stay put and be hunted by the Taliban, or should they make their way to a border and risk being turned back? Could the Foreign Secretary take care of some basic issues? The Home Office phone number provided to Afghans asks people to hold for hours, and it's still chargeable. This is pretty easy to fix. Could he have a word with the Home Secretary and get it dealt with? He wasn't able to tell us how many British nationals are still there, but I imagine he must know by now. So can he tell us? We know that only one security guard from the embassy got out, so what is his plan for the rest? I did a quick check before I left my office today. There are still hundreds of unanswered emails from MPs, and many of them have raised that with the Prime Minister today. How many staff are now working on this in the Foreign Office, and why hasn't it been dealt with? If they're to get an answer by this evening, can he assure us that that will be a real answer and not just a holding response? And can we have some clarity about who is actually eligible, particularly under the ARAP scheme? And it's welcome that the Defence Secretary has stayed for this statement. Without clarity about who is eligible, people can't risk heading to the border. So the special cases in particular, it would be really useful to have a much tighter idea of who they are. What is the assurance about safe passage that he believes he has from the Taliban? Does it apply to all those with documentation or just the British nationals? I understand that the technical problems at the airport have now been overcome, and that is welcome, but can he tell us a bit more about the diplomatic progress that has been made? How, for example, does he intend to square the circle to comply with the Taliban's refusal to allow a foreign military presence, but to safeguard those technicians from Turkey or Qatar or whichever other country is chosen to oversee that operation in order to make sure that they can be safeguarded? I very much support his view that it would be wrong to recognise the Taliban as a legitimate government, but this also presents a practical challenge to those countries that are considering stepping in to oversee the airport about how guarantees can be upheld. Can I just say to him that the coordination between the Foreign Office and the Ministry of Defence, despite some very hard-working civil servants on the ground who are working round the clock, is still appalling. My office is in touch with a small number of Afghan workers, for example, who were attached to intelligence and to MI6 in recent years. They're being treated as special cases under ARAP, and many of them have been waiting for months. I would like to place on record my thanks to the Secretary of State for Defence and also to the Minister for Afghanistan, who've made themselves available to many of us at all hours and short notice to assist with some of these cases. Their personal intervention has made a difference, but this is no substitute for a system. Could he also clear up some comments that he made at the Select Committee? He suggested that those who've been cleared to travel as part of Operation Pitting would now have to undergo security checks before they were accepted onto ARAP. Were those checks not initially done, or is he now reneging on his promise? I have to say that both of those scenarios concern us greatly. Mr Speaker, these are practical issues that are within his gift, and the fact that they still haven't been dealt with sends a strong message that he's been more focused in recent days on keeping his job than actually doing it. I want him to prove us wrong, because a lot rides on this, including the lives of many Afghans who assisted us. Could I also ask him to say a bit more about how the UK is going to get aid into Afghanistan to those who need it? I've been in touch with aid workers on the ground, many of them female, who've been banned from working by the Taliban. Those aid agencies, of course, are understandably saying they won't operate with those conditions in place, but that means they're not operating at all. And on the refugee crisis, can I just say to him gently that countries in the region are not hugely impressed by the decision by the Home Secretary to cap the number of refugees that the UK will accept at 5,000. When they're dealing with a far greater refugee crisis, a bit of generosity from the UK would go a long way to helping to resolve the issues at the borders. Mr Speaker, these are immediate concerns, but we are also concerned that for a generation of young Afghans, the future that they'd expected is unravelling in front of their eyes. Can he say something about the LGBT plus community and how their rights will be upheld as well as religious minorities? Can he outline the measures that he intends to take to set conditions for the Taliban regime, and particularly that the situation of women and girls will be the cornerstone of any future engagement? And finally, Mr Speaker, can I just say that our intelligence has been downgraded, our diplomats and troops are now longer on the ground, and the Prime Minister appeared to say in the statement just now that the risk that is posed to the UK is unknown. He suggested in a media interview that we would rely on open source intelligence. Could he say some more about that? And also that we might be in a position where we were sharing intelligence with countries like China and Russia. Given the significant national security implications of this, the House has a right to understand what the government's strategy is on this, if there is one. This has been nothing short of a disaster, Mr Speaker. So can I ask him now to turn with humility to the world and start to repair some of those broken relationships, those trashed alliances, those broken promises that have reduced us to a position where we're reliant on the Taliban for permission to safeguard our own citizens and negotiating with China and Russia in our own interests. In the cold, hard light of what has unfolded over this summer, surely it is time for him to rethink his approach to the way that Britain engages with the rest of the world.
Yeah. Foreign Secretary.
Can I thank the Honourable Lady for what she said about the efforts of our UK forces, and I believe also the cross-Whitehall teams who've delivered the biggest evacuation in living memory. She asked for specific advice. She'll understand I'm a bit reticent about giving personal advice to generically, but the travel advice that the SCDO putting out is very clear, and it has been changed to reflect the situation on the ground, and I think that is the right point of reference for constituents of honourable members around the House. She asked about phone calls into the SCDO Crisis Centre. Since the 11th of August, it's handled more than 44,000 calls. We surged 45 members of SCDO staff and 35 staff from other departments. Since the 19th of August, we've answered well over 90%, 93% of the total number received. And every day since the 24th, our call handlers have answered more than 94% of the calls that were made. And just to give the Honourable Lady a sense, since the 20th of August, average wait times have been less than a minute. She also asked about correspondence. As my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, made clear, we will have sent a reply to all MPs' emails asking for an update by the 30th. Emails that we received by the 30th of August, we will reply to all of them today. That will be to enable to signpost them to the specific advice relevant to the particular case that they're raising. We will also respond to all the other emails that we've received by members of the public. She made some points, and a couple honourable members have made this point, certainly on her side, about putting them all in together. These are different cases. The eligibility for nationality is different from the resettlement scheme, which is different from ARAP. So it is right that they are triaged to the proper decision maker, and that's the point of the exercise that we're engaged in. In relation to ARAP, she asked about the details. The ARAP scheme is published, so the details are there. Well, if she's concerned about any particular aspects, then of course she should approach the relevant minister. She asked about safe passage and how well, we can't answer the questions, the Honourable Lady, in abstract. in order to give effect to the circumstances of the cases she's referring to. She asked about safe passage. The Taliban has given us an assurance that those nationals and those that work for us who want to leave will be allowed to leave. But like a range of other commitments that they've made, we'll have to hold them. These will form one of the early tests for the Taliban, and they will be judged by what they do rather than just what they say. But that was the reason that we passed, and she talks about influence. We led with the French and the Americans the UN Security Council resolution, which reiterated and affirmed and applied the international community's imprimatur on that demand of the Taliban. We'll now have to see whether they can pass that test. She mentioned Kabul Airport. Kabul Airport is not up and running yet, but there are efforts ongoing to deal with not only the operational capacity, the technical capacity, but also the security conditions. And I think for most cases, whether they're British nationals, Arab or special cases, indeed under the resettlement scheme, the most straightforward way would be if we can safely see Kabul Airport up and running. If not, we'll have to look at third country routes out. But of course, many of the third countries in the region are very nervous. We've had conversations with all of them. That was why I was in Qatar, Pakistan, to look at the arrangements, the practical arrangements for how we would deliver on it. She asked about security checks. Of course, we will make sure that in relation to those wanting to come to the UK, that not only do we check the eligibility so that the seats on planes are going to those who we want to come, who are eligible to come, who we need to come, and also to make sure the security checks are in place to avoid the wrong kind of people coming back to the UK. She also asked about aid into Afghanistan and how we can ensure it gets to where it needs to go. We've provided, and I announced last week, £30 million for neighbouring countries to deal with refugees in the region, precisely because it is better for refugees to be dealt with closer to their home, but also because we do recognise the burden that will be placed on the region. In relation to aid more generally and the rest of the 286 million, of course, this is another of the early tests for the Taliban, because we will not give aid to the Taliban, and therefore if they want to avoid the social and economic fabric of the country collapsing, if they want the aid to continue to flow, they will need to provide a safe operating environment for the UN and other agencies. And I spoke to the UN Secretary General's Special Envoy, Jean Arnaud, precisely about that. We've got further meetings this week with G7+. I will have further conversations. I'm sure I'll be travelling to the region. The UK has issued a G7 paper which sets out the key priorities from counter-terrorism to the humanitarian lifeline. It's been very well received. What we've now got to do, working with our partners, is operationalise it. She asked about some of the non-G7 partners. The reality is, if we want to influence in the most effective way possible the Taliban, we need a broader caucus, particularly regional countries, particularly those who also have a relationship with the Taliban, to exercise the maximum moderating influence on the Taliban. And that's just what we're doing.
SNP spokesperson Alan Smith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm also grateful for advance sight of the statement, and I have to say on behalf of my group that the impression we've been given about ministerial communications with members of this House in constituency cases is not as rosy as has been put forward by government ministers, and I would constructively suggest that there needs to be a proper review of how adequate things actually were, because our experience certainly was not as good as we've been told. I'm glad to see that the resettlement scheme is now moving, the new resettlement scheme, but I would like to unpack what 20,000 over the coming years actually means, because it's a good line, but I don't think it will stand analysis. I fear it won't stand analysis. Does it mean that if 20,000 Afghans apply and are processed in the first few months of next year, the scheme will close, in which case the scheme is wholly inadequate? Or does it mean that there's an annual quota? And how long does that mean that the UK government thinks vulnerable Afghans should wait while the Taliban hunts them down? In which case the scheme strikes me as similarly inadequate. We would like to see the scheme expanded, and we would like to see much more clarity, which I understand is coming, for the devolved administrations and local governments, particularly about how family reunion will be counted within those numbers, because that is a crucial point for a number of Afghans already here and those who are concerned. Also picking up on the Foreign Secretary's line about safe and legal routes to here. And in the name of policy coherence, surely now is the time for the UK government to pause the Immigration and Nationality Bill, because it would penalise many Afghans arriving by other routes, and Afghanistan is in chaos, and they're not going to be able to form an orderly queue in perhaps the way one might like, Madam Deputy Speaker. So surely in the name of policy coherence, one part of the UK government should not be penalising Afghans arriving here while another part of the UK government is trying to save them and keep them safe. Thank you.
Foreign Secretary.
Well, can I thank the honourable gentleman for his remarks? He raises perfectly reasonable questions. On the correspondence, I've already set out before the House how we're dealing with that. I would just say to him that we had, of course, a surge of cases and indeed requests for updates in the final days of the evacuation, and at that time I think rightly we took the decision, and I took the decision, that our focus ought to be on getting as many people as we possibly could out of Afghanistan onto flights and back home to safety, which is how we've achieved this remarkable figure of over 15,000 in the space of just a couple of weeks. But of course we do want to make sure colleagues in this House are updated, signposted to the right advice, and those from who have emailed or called directly get the advice that they need. He asked a range of questions on the resettlement scheme. They're probably more for the Home Secretary than for me, but let me tell him the plan is for 5,000 to be resettled this year, 20,000 over the course of the next few years. That comes on top of the Arab scheme. And I believe not only are we right to lead by example in the way I've described, right to also, when it comes to aid, provide the £30 million to neighbouring countries so that we can support them in taking those refugees, but also use that leadership by example to corral and cajole other countries to step up. We're not going to be able to take all of the refugees or those wishing to leave Afghanistan. We do our bit, but we also then call on others and use the example that we've set to cajole and to encourage others to do the same. Further details on the scheme will be set out by the Home Secretary. He also asked about whether we would strip out the legislative checks that are applying more broadly. I don't think that's the right thing to do, and I don't think our constituents would want us, as we are in a good-hearted way, making sure that this country is taking in not just our nationals, but those who are fleeing Afghanistan because they've worked for us or for other reasons. I do think that they'll want to see us take a responsible approach and have the checks in place to make sure that that system isn't abused.
Dr. Andrew Morrison.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Congratulations to all involved in Operation Pitting, including my right honourable friend. It seems unlikely that the Taliban is going to continue to cooperate with safe passage of Afghans to the UK, that is to say, in order to safeguard those individuals from the Taliban. Therefore, focus will shift to, sadly, refugee camps in countries surrounding Afghanistan. What read across does he see between this situation and the highly successful Syrian resettlement programme? And in particular, what measures has he discussed with the UN to triage people so that we take from amongst the most vulnerable, as we do with the Syrian programme? And has he engaged with other countries, as we engage with, for example, Turkey, in trying to make sure that we take those who are most vulnerable to relocate them back to the UK, to locations such as Wiltshire, in my own constituency, that has done its part in helping people from that particularly challenged part of the world.
Can I thank my honourable friend and pay tribute to his time as a Foreign Office Minister? I think he's right. We are already consulting with the United Nations. The Prime Minister has spoken to the UN Secretary General. I spoke to his Special Envoy for Afghanistan, Jean Arnaud, to talk through these issues and make sure we get the eligibility and the coordination right. He's also right, I believe, to refer to the Syrian precedent. We want to learn the lessons for it. There was much that was a success there. Of course, the circumstances in Afghanistan are different, and the Home Secretary will set out further details in due course once we've completed that, and it will feed in all of the conversations we're having, not just with the UN, but with allies, including Turkey, and with other countries around the region.
Harriet Harman.
Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Foreign Secretary for his statement. Can I ask him about the number of requests that the government has already had in respect of Afghan citizens who don't qualify for the Arab scheme as they didn't work directly for us, but who want and need to flee here from Afghanistan and have already asked? I know the Afghan Citizens Resettlement Scheme is not yet open, but he must already know how many have, through members of this House or other organisations, already asked to come here because of the Taliban. Can he tell us how many? And how is the government going to make the decision about who is going to get into the 5,000 cap? The criteria for the Afghan Citizens Resettlement Scheme are yet to be announced, but we know that it's for those who are highly vulnerable to the Taliban because of what they've done in support of the values which we and the previous regime were committed to, particularly women and girls, equality, democracy and human rights. There are bound to be so many more than 5,000. How will the government in practice decide between those who will be the lucky 5,000 and be allowed to come here and those who, though meeting the criteria, will, because of the 5,000 cap, be refused and face a terrible fate at the hands of the Taliban? I think the reality is, unless they increase the 5,000 cap, the Afghan Citizens Resettlement Scheme is going to end up as a lottery of life and death.
Foreign Secretary.
Can I thank the Honourable Lady, and I know how passionately she takes this issue and how assiduous she's been on it. In relation to the number of applications and claims, it's difficult to give a precise number, not least because of some of the duplication, the multiple emails and correspondence we've had. I think she's right to say, frankly, even if we doubled or tripled the quota, the number of people fleeing Afghanistan is going to outstrip what the UK would be able to take alone. Which means that we need to look very carefully, as the Home Secretary and I are doing with across government, at the criteria to make sure that we prioritise the most vulnerable, those with a particular link to the UK, and also coordinate with the United Nations. Further details will be set out by the Home Secretary. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, this is the UK doing our bit alongside the aid that we're providing, including to support third countries taking refugees. We will not be able to, the UK will not be able to deal with the demand alone. Of course we wouldn't do so. What we do by showing this action and this leadership is help corral and cajole other countries to follow suit. And that is the way we'll have a comprehensive and effective response to the Afghanistan situation.
Order. I do want to try to get everybody in, but we need to finish this statement by about 10 to 6, so if colleagues could bear that in mind. Elisa Kearns.
Mr. Speaker, the Taliban want cash, international recognition and propaganda coups. I'm gravely concerned by the International Director of Travel towards recognising them. So will he reassure me that we're doing all we can to stop colleagues, other partner countries from doing so, stop them from giving them any cash? And will he consider using the conflict sector to set up an international mechanism for atrocity management to make sure that we know exactly what is happening on the ground, we are monitoring it and we can reveal them for who they truly are internationally around the world?
Foreign Secretary.
Can I thank my honourable friend? First of all, she's right about holding them to account, particularly in relation to human rights and the approach they take to women and girls. Getting access to on the ground is obviously the main challenge. That's why we need to see, as well as the humanitarian access, first of all to provide that lifeline, but also to give us the information that she described. On recognition, we will not recognise the Taliban. In fact, the UK government doesn't recognise governments as distinct from states. What we've said and what we're encouraging our allies and partners around the region to do is set some early tests for engagement with the Taliban on safe passage, on a permissive environment for humanitarian groups operating on the ground in Afghanistan, and on their commitment never to allow Afghanistan to be used as a safe haven for terrorism. If they follow through on those and they show that they can be a constructive partner, albeit at a different level of expectation than we would have with our more like-minded countries, then we can see what that can develop into. It is important to engage without bestowing legitimacy on the Taliban regime.
Dame Diana Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Foreign Secretary said in his opening remarks, we must prevent Afghanistan from ever becoming a haven for terrorist groups. Of course, we all agree with that. I just wondered if the Foreign Secretary agreed with what the Prime Minister has just said to the House, though, when he talked about the Taliban cracking down on terrorism. Is that a credible statement from our Prime Minister?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, I'd say to the Honourable Lady that there's clearly a difference between the Taliban and groups like ISIS-K or Al-Qaeda. And indeed, there is suspicion, but I wouldn't say more than that, that at the Abbey Gate attack that is from ISIS-K, the part of the intention was to target the Taliban. So clearly the Taliban, if it wants to be an effective administration of some sort, if it wants to avoid all of the disastrous mistakes made previously, they will have to live up to the assurances that they've made to avoid Afghanistan becoming a harbour or safe haven for terrorism. Now, I share the measure of scepticism that she described, but I think it is right for the international community, as we did with the UN Security Council resolution last week, to hold the Taliban to those commitments and test quite what the level of engagement can produce in terms of constructive results.
Crispin Blunt.
The inclusion in the Prime Minister's statement of sexuality as an identified risk for Afghans who need rescue. My right honourable friend made a direction around this early in the crisis, and I will report to the Foreign Affairs Committee in evidence about how that went thereafter, which was, I'm afraid, unsatisfactory. However, I would particularly like to ask my right honourable friend whether he agrees that unlimited objectives, as we set ourselves in Afghanistan when this exercise began, with only limited means, is always going to run the risk of failure, and that this failure in this case has done awful damage to our values and reinforced the appeal of our enemies. Will he confirm that the Chicago Doctrine, which is one of the roots of this, as well as a willful ignorance of history, will have no part in the values and his understanding of how global Britain is going to operate in future?
Secretary.
Can I thank my honourable friend and just say, first of all, I know he's raised LGBT rights in relation to the vulnerability of Afghans and the resettlement scheme. I've discussed that directly with the Home Secretary. I understand the importance of that, and we want to make sure that with the details of the resettlement scheme, we cover all of those who are particularly at risk, and I think that group clearly is particularly at risk. He asked about interventionism more generally. I think he will see in the integrated review not just a strategic policy for the United Kingdom for the 21st century, on tech, on trade, on the UK as a force for good, but a very rigorous approach to reconcile ends with means. And I do think he's right to say that there are lessons for that over 20 years in Afghanistan.
And then Kaiser Javid.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the news that last week the Foreign Secretary visited Pakistan, a key figure in the region. However, does the Foreign Secretary accept that it's simply unacceptable that he didn't call Shah Mahmood Qureshi, Pakistan's Foreign Minister, in the 6 months before the Taliban takeover, given the UK's overwhelming interests in the region at the time of crisis?
Foreign Secretary.
What can I say to the Honourable Lady? We have an excellent relationship with Pakistan. She's right that on my visit I saw Prime Minister Khan and Foreign Minister Qureshi. The Minister of State, the Noble Lord Ahmed, had visited Pakistan in June. We've made sure, Prime Minister through me, right the way down, we're in constant contact. And of course, the bilateral relationship as well as their relevance and importance on Afghanistan is something very dear to our hearts, and we discussed at length when I was there.
Felicity Buchan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I would like to sincerely thank the Foreign Office and the Ministry of Defence for their help in evacuating several Kensington-related families. I still do have British nationals with Afghan dependent minor children and spouses in Afghanistan. Can I encourage my right honourable friend to encourage the Home Office to publish the details of the Afghanistan resettlement scheme as quickly as possible so that these families know where they stand?
Foreign Secretary.
Can I thank my honourable friend? She's absolutely right. Thank you to her also for paying tribute to the cross-Whitehall teams that work so assiduously under immense pressure. Of course, with cases like the one she described, they could be eligible under the nationality criteria, depending on the nature of the dependents, or separately under the resettlement scheme. So the particular circumstances will be relevant and important, but of course we will make sure that the resettlement scheme and the full details are published shortly.
Ellie Reeves.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The government say that the number of British nationals left in Afghanistan are in the low hundreds, but in my constituency alone, I have 11 constituents stuck, including an 18-month-old baby. Many of them witnessed horror at Kabul airport, and fearing the Taliban, they are now petrified and in hiding. When I contact the Foreign Office about these cases, all I get is cut and paste responses. So I ask the Foreign Secretary, What will he do to guarantee their security, and will he give his word that these British nationals will get home safely?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, can I thank the Honourable Lady? Of course, we're going to do everything we conceivably can. And one of the reasons that we didn't get everyone out is because some were afraid. The conditions on the ground were objectively very challenging. But we are committed, both through our efforts with countries, but also seeing when and how Kabul Airport can be reopened to make sure, in relation to UK nationals, in relation to the qualifying dependents, in relation to the Afghans that work for us and the other special cases, as well as the resettlement scheme, we do everything we can for her cases, and I'm very happy to continue to support her in that endeavour.
Sir Desmond Swain.
What succour will he give to the resistance in the Panjshir?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, we're watching the developments on the ground very carefully, but I think it's fair to say that the Taliban is in control of the vast majority of Afghanistan, and I don't think it is the right thing at the moment to start supporting other groups, notwithstanding our previous role. I think we have to adjust, and I say this to my honourable friend with understanding of his passion, his knowledge about this. We have to adjust to the new reality that we see on the ground.
Stuart Hosey.
Mr. Speaker, I have to say my blood ran rather cold when the Foreign Secretary suggested that the Home Secretary would have anything to do with helping refugees. However, can I say there are members around this House who have been supporting Afghan nationals to try and get them out of Afghanistan. People who have now burned their documents, deleted electronic records, who've even seen their internet profile and footprint deleted by organisations which they used to work for. So can we have a categoric, cast-iron assurance from the Minister today that no one entitled to support to leave when the routes are open will ever be turned away for the absence of a piece of paper or an electronic record?
Well, I just say to the honourable gentleman, I don't think the Home Secretary or I, both the children of refugees, need to be lectured on the subject by him in the terms and the tone that he described. And we'll do everything we can to get those eligible home, but we're not going to dispense with the basic checks that we need. He calls it a piece of paper, but the basic checks we need to make sure we keep this country safe from those who aren't eligible and will put our safety at risk.
Ruth Edwards.
Deputy Speaker. The Taliban's values may not have changed, but their use of technology has. What assessment has the government made of ways in which the Taliban may be using technologies like social media to track opponents and to spread disinformation? And how can we work with our allies and with social media companies to counter this?
Foreign Secretary.
Can I thank the Honourable Lady? I'm not going to go into too much of the operational details, but I think it is fair to say that the new iteration of the Taliban is a more sophisticated operator in many different ways, not just the comms that they're engaged in, but also their ability to use technology. And I think that, at least at one level, could have a positive effect, but it also has and creates new risks and threats, and we will monitor that very carefully with our allies.
Clive Efford.
Speaker, I pay tribute to everyone who worked on the airlift from the 15th of August. We had 18 months' notice that this situation would come about. And I have to say to the Foreign Secretary that the organisation here, for us, raising cases on behalf of our constituents was nothing short of chaotic. Yes. The different phone numbers, the lack of information, lack of feedback, we still don't even know whether anything that we wrote and passed in on behalf of our constituents had any effect whatsoever. And the Foreign Secretary has said that the work to get people to safety started long before the 15th of August, and he said that 500 UK nationals got out. That doesn't sound many. So what of those people who we had an obligation to, who were in Afghanistan, who are Afghanistan nationals who work with our government? How many of those did we get out before the 15th of August?
Foreign Secretary.
Can I thank the honourable gentleman? I mean, he issues a fair challenge, but I'm afraid there is an equally fair and reasonable answer to that. We have standing evacuation plans in place for all high-risk embassies. Our central assessment, as I've made clear before, although we considered all eventualities, was that there would be a slow deterioration in security from the end of August after NATO troops are withdrawn. So from April, I was very focused in the run-up to our June G7 summit on securing the US assurances to allow us to shift our embassy from the green zone to the airport. He asked about what we were doing before in the months that preceded the evacuation. From April, we speeded up the relocation of former Afghan staff under the ARAP programme from April onwards, relocating, in answer to his question, nearly 2,000 in that period. We changed our advice in April and then again in later on to be, so from April, we've been very clear advising British nationals to consider leaving Afghanistan. Our timing, I think by way of international comparator, was in sync with what our NATO allies were doing. And of course, I would also point out that commercial flights were running up until the 14th of August. So no one, not even the Taliban, I think had expected them to gain ground as rapidly as they did. I think that's the view amongst NATO allies. It was certainly also the view of regional partners when I was in the region, Qatar and Pakistan last week.
Richard Graham. Settlement of the Afghan families of British citizens and those with the right to remain here. How confident is my right honourable friend that agreement will be reached with the Taliban and other governments of neighbouring countries, including Pakistan, so that those needing to cross the border won't be prevented on the one side or turned away on the other? Will that include Iran for those who have already crossed the border at Herat? And when does he expect that the processes and resources will be in place so that we can update constituents? Thank you.
Can I thank my honourable friend? I mean, on my last update, but it's changing, it's very fluid, I think all of the borders have been closed with the exception of Iran. So let's be very clear. When I was in Pakistan, the border with Afghanistan had been closed. So this is going to be a challenge. And what we want to do is make sure that we've got arrangements in place, that the willingness and the ability to process British cases, whether they're nationals or ARAP eligible cases, will be seen by those third countries as taking some of the burden off them. At the same time, of course, it would be much more straightforward if the airport at Kabul could be made up and running. But there are not just technical capacity issues with that, there's clearly the security situation on the ground. So we're alive to all of these risks, we're working all of them through, including with our allies, and that's why I was in the region last week.
Leila Moran.
Deputy Speaker. About 10 days ago, I met with Oxford's Hazara community. And one described how they had paid exorbitant amounts of money to human traffickers for their family to get to the Pakistan border and then get over the border itself. They had been turned away because they weren't of the right tribe. Can the Foreign Secretary, first of all, assure us, are the Hazaras considered a vulnerable group? Because history tells us and present tells us that they are. But also, when he talks about safe passage, is he specifically considering how to get to the border and over the border, not just what happens to them when they get to the border, because for many people that's not a possibility.
Here.
Can I thank the Honourable Lady? She's absolutely right that ethnic groups, the Saris and others, would be considered as part of the eligibility in the same way as LGBT, but effectively what we're looking at is risk. That will depend on the individual, but also the group, but she's right to raise ethnicity as a risk. Clearly, in relation to getting to the edge of the Afghan border, that will require the Taliban to allow safe passage. I've explained to the House how we're working on that. And what we're also trying to do, and that's why I was in Pakistan and Qatar, that's why I spoke to the Uzbek Foreign Minister earlier today, it's why we're engaging with all of those regional partners. We want to be clear that we've got the capacity to process and give them the assurance to let those individuals across the border and that we will take them directly back to the UK. And I've deployed a team of 15 additional rapid deployment team experts to support that process in the region. But the crucial question at the moment will be, will the Taliban offer safe passage, and will those other countries in the region be willing to allow at least a measured and controlled opening of their borders?
Bob Stewart.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Linking to my honourable friend for Gloucester's question, he mentioned Herat. There's 572 miles western border between Iran and Afghanistan, 572 miles. Something like 780,000 refugees from Afghanistan are in Iran, perhaps 2 or 3 times that number unregistered. Is there any possibility that we can use exit routes from via Herat or elsewhere in Afghanistan to get people to this country?
Foreign Secretary.
Can I thank my honourable friend, and I know from his time in active service how much first-hand experience he's got of these matters. Of course, the relationship with the new government of Iran remains one that will have to be tested. But I can tell him that both on the JCPOA and more broadly, I had a consistent and constructive dialogue with the previous Foreign Minister, and we will see, and I will certainly remain open to continuing that with his successor, which would allow us to address these wider issues, which I think will be in Iran's interest, as well as obviously the UK and other countries.
Dr. Lisa Cameron.
Many thanks, Madam Deputy Speaker. As Chair of the Disability All-Party Parliamentary Group, I've been receiving concerns from people across the United Kingdom regarding the vulnerability of people with disabilities at risk who can't get to safety in Afghanistan and can't get to the airport, particularly those who are part of ethnic minority groups or religious groups such as Christians. So will the Foreign Secretary link with the Disability All-Party Parliamentary Group to make sure that the resettlement programme is inclusive for the most vulnerable and that those with disabilities are never left behind?
Foreign Secretary.
Can I thank the Honourable Lady and thank her for the work that she and the APPG are doing? I think she raises a really important point. It's a very practical point, but will only exacerbate the fear and the anxiety of those, particularly if they're disabled from an ethnic minority that she described. I would urge her to send me and the Home Secretary any papers or recommendations that the APPG has.
Given the way in which the Taliban has taken a lot of NATO equipment to strengthen their hold on the country, how could we send aid in without the Taliban using or abusing that for their own purposes?
Can I thank my right honourable friend? We will not give aid to the Taliban, and I think the Taliban has a choice and a set of decisions that it's got to make about whether it wants to preside over the wholesale economic and social collapse of the fabric of the country. If not, it's going to have to give certain assurances. I think that will particularly apply in relation to the permissive environment that we would need for aid agencies in order to continue our aid. So again, it falls within the category of early tests for the Taliban, and that's why we'll engage with them without recognising them.
Ruth Capri.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I also had constituents who couldn't get to the Baron Hotel as a result of illness and disability. And on Saturday it was reported that British citizens seeking to flee into Uzbekistan were not able to cross the border, while citizens of other states, such as Germany, were able to do so. So what steps will the government take to ensure that British nationals and Afghans eligible for support here are able to safely cross borders and get into safety?
Can I thank the Honourable Lady? I think it's not quite right what she said about the German case, and my understanding is that there was a previous German case that was allowed onward passage, but the border has been closed. I spoke to the Uzbek Foreign Minister earlier today, as I have been with the foreign ministers around the region, to, as we've done in Pakistan, try and set up a workable system. So if British nationals or Afghan workers, or indeed other cases that we are willing to take and we can give that undertaking, they can be allowed into Uzbekistan for onward passage to the UK. So we're doing everything we can to make sure that that's possible.
Angela Richardson.
The positive impact of 20 years of education for millions of girls and young women in Afghanistan has changed countless lives for the better. Can my right honourable friend confirm the government will be using every tool at its disposal to place pressure on the Taliban and protect the progress made on the rights of women and girls?
Foreign Secretary.
Can I thank my honourable friend? British aid allowed 10 million more children to get access to a decent education over that last 20 years. 4 out of 10 of them were young girls who would have never seen a school book otherwise. I think that is absolutely one of the crucial social gains that we need to try and consolidate and avoid being rolled back. And whenever I've spoken to any of my G7 partners, or indeed partners in the region, I think there has been clarity that we need to work together to exercise the maximum moderating influence that we possibly can to make sure those gains aren't lost.
Gavin Newlands.
Quarter of 2020, the Home Office was rejecting more than half of all asylum applications from Afghan nationals. Will the Foreign Secretary back up some of his language that he's used today and urge his colleague, the Home Secretary, to ensure all Afghan appeals undergo a review to reassess their suitability for a grant of asylum before they are listed and heard in court?
Yeah. Foreign Secretary.
I would just say to the Honourable Gentleman, I understand the passion with which he speaks. We've taken over 17,000 people, of course not all, many of those British nationals, but also other Afghan nationals. We've allocated over the next few years 20,000 that we'll take, but we can't take all of them, which is why it's right to check eligibility and also right to work with those partners in the region and across the world to make sure they also can bear the burden in tandem.
John Howell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. My friend might like to note that the Council of Europe will be debating Afghanistan in a matter of weeks, but I wonder whether he has seen the pictures that appeared today of musical instruments that have been smashed by the Taliban, who have banned Western music. And can I encourage him to take a special interest in girls and women, particularly those of the Afghan Women's Orchestra, who are threatened by the Taliban at the moment?
Foreign Secretary.
Can I thank my honourable friend, pay tribute to the work he's doing in the Council of Europe and for highlighting cases like that. We are clearly going to face challenging times. We need to adjust our thinking to the new reality, but of course we'll do everything we can to protect the gains and preserve the gains, including in relation to girls' education, but also wider social activity, including music.
Andrew Gwynn.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Earlier, the Prime Minister said to the House, tell them that this country and the Western world were protected from Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan throughout this period. And the Foreign Secretary furthered that by saying, first, we must prevent Afghanistan from ever again becoming a haven for terrorist groups. I agree entirely with both of those statements, but we are putting a lot of trust in the murderous medieval Taliban. What if the training camps and the terror networks return? What do we do?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, can I thank the Honourable Gentleman? Look, I share his concern. I think it's probably the single biggest concern and risk that honourable members across the House have. In the last analysis, we reserved the right to exercise the right of self-defence. We always do. And it's not quite right to say, though, that we trust the Taliban or that we can trust the Taliban. What we need to do is be willing to engage, set some early tests, of which this is one, and then monitor very carefully and judge them by what they do, not just by what they say.
Greg Clark.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm grateful. Like every member of this House, I have many constituents who are desperately concerned that they have friends and relatives who are at imminent risk of reprisals by the Taliban. For them, the crisis is now, not evenly spaced over 5 years. So will the Foreign Secretary and his colleagues show some flexibility to make sure that we can rescue those at the time of need as part of the scheme that is being worked up?
Well, can I thank my right honourable friend? And I understand the point he makes. I think it is right to have the resettlement scheme over a number of years, because the history tells us that we'll be dealing with this challenge for some time. But we have, and I would say, also catered and addressed the immediate short term. We've got over 17,000 people out. That includes around 500 special cases, which includes achieving scholars, female judges, female rights activists, journalists and many others. So we're trying to get the right balance between a sustainable long-term strategy but also dealing with those who are fleeing persecution immediately.
Alison Thulis.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Many of my constituents' families are still facing difficulties in getting out, including a family of a 17-year-old constituent who made it to the visa application centre in Islamabad only to find that part of their family reunion paperwork has been lost by officials. Others are awaiting DNA tests and TB paperwork. Can I ask what's he going to do to address this paperwork issue? And can I have a meeting urgently to discuss the other 85 cases and over 100 Afghans that my office is supporting?
Foreign Secretary.
Can I thank the Honourable Lady? That's one of the reasons I went to Islamabad. I talked to the High Commission team that is dealing with and supporting those applications and those cases. We are trying to work through them as assiduously as we can. If she has examples of cases where she feels that they haven't been handled properly, she should send them to me, and I or Lord Ahmed will be very happy to sit down with her.
Holly Mumby-Croft.
Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank my honourable friend for the work he is doing and for the work that his team are continuing to do? Can he give any further detail on his assessment of the time frame we may be looking at to help those British nationals still stuck in Kabul? I appreciate it's incredibly difficult, but if you could give a time frame at all.
Foreign Secretary.
Can I thank the Honourable Lady and appreciate what she said. The reality is it will depend on two factors. One is, first of all, is the ability to get Kabul airport up and running. That would in many ways be the most straightforward because, particularly engaged with the Qataris, we could not only get easier, more direct access out of the country, but we can look at what possible pre-checks that we can do as well to check eligibility and things like that. If not, then the alternative is third countries. As you'll imagine, a lot of the third countries are very anxious at the moment about a potential exodus. So we need to make sure that we approach them with a view to supporting them to take those cases that would come to the UK. I just can't give her a definitive time frame, but the reason I was out in Qatar, who are helping on the airport, and in Pakistan, which is probably the most of the neighbouring countries, the most likely source of destination for those leaving, is precisely to work through those arrangements and make clear what we'll do to cooperate and coordinate.
If we have very short questions and short answers, we will possibly get through everybody. James Murray.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As of this morning, I had received urgent, heartbreaking pleas from 289 constituents of mine about well over 1,500 of their loved ones desperate to get out of Afghanistan. My team and I have been doing everything we can to help, but we need the government to respond and to be clear about what options people might have. So can the Secretary of State make clear whether the response the Prime Minister promised today will include a specific response to the inquiries that I and other MPs have raised? And can he confirm when the eligibility for the Afghan Citizens Resettlement Scheme will be published?
We'll do everything we can to support my honourable friend and indeed support the honourable member and indeed honourable members across the House. I think the thing to understand is that there are three separate ways of being eligible to come to the UK. We want to triage the cases and point them in the direction of the right port of call and give them the right advice for each one of those three channels, rather than mixing them together, given that they are not the same eligibility criteria.
Simon Jupp.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Does the Foreign Secretary agree with me that it's strange to hear the Labour Party criticise the government for unnecessary withdrawal from Afghanistan when the Shadow Foreign Secretary said that the mission had outlived its usefulness only in July?
It's supposed to be the Foreign Secretary.
Honourable friend makes a good point, the truth is, throughout this crisis, we've had a litany of critique without really very serious or credible suggestions for doing anything alternative. But the reality is also, I want to recognise that beyond the Labour front bench, there are honourable members across the House who've got very legitimate and genuine concerns, and we're doing everything we can to support those.
Farron.
Does the Foreign Secretary believe he will be more persuasive in his attempts to persuade the neighbouring countries of Afghanistan to keep or indeed make sure their borders are open to refugees if our country took more than a desultory 5,000 as a limit and saw that as a minimum number of refugees we would take rather than a maximum?
Yeah.
Well, to just say to the honourable gentleman, I understand the point he makes, but I think there's no country proportionately doing more. If you take not only what we're doing on the resettlement scheme, but the 17,000 that have come back to the UK, the 30 million that I announced at the end of last week to support those third countries. And I think it's right that we do our bit, but I also think it's right, and I have to say this to him, as a matter of policy, as a matter of moral responsibility, to try and allow refugees to be settled closer to their home so that in the future they may be able to return back.
Henry Smith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. What assessment has my right honourable friend made of China's growing involvement in Afghanistan, the geopolitical consequences and the United Kingdom's response to that?
Well, can I thank my honourable friend? I spoke to my counterpart, Foreign Minister Wang Yi, and I will speak to him again in the near future. I think there's a lot of talk about how China wants to rush in and fill the vacuum in Afghanistan. I have to say, I'm not entirely convinced that they do want to bear the entirety of the burden, whether it's the security and the terrorist burden or the financial burden of a country in such a precarious, fragile position. So whilst we have many areas where it is challenging with China, actually this is something where there are some commonalities of views and interests. And I think in a situation like this, whether it's China or whether it's other countries in the region, we need to try and work together, because we're much, much more likely, if we do so, to exercise maximum moderating influence on the Taliban, and that's what will yield results.
Asfal Khan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. With the Taliban takeover, many of my constituents are Hazara Shia and fear their family's safety. There's also a minority Uyghur community in Afghanistan who are in hiding, scared that they will be handed over to China. So what steps is the Foreign Secretary taking to protect these minorities?
Foreign Secretary.
Can I thank the Honourable Gentleman, and I think he raised a very real issue. As I've already said to the House, we'll make sure that vulnerability based on ethnicity will be considered in the resettlement scheme. And it's crucial if you, and I refer to the G7 paper that the UK has put forward, one of the things that we will have to judge the Taliban on, one of the early tests will be, is it serious about being a more inclusive government? And that will mean human rights, obviously in relation to women, but also its treatment of ethnic minorities.
David Simmons.
When we designed the Syrian resettlement scheme, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees played a crucial role as an independent and neutral party to identify those eligible for resettlement and then make the connections with the authorities of the countries willing to take them in, including the UK. So may I ask my right honourable friend what discussions have taken place between the government and the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees about doing this work, and if it is his view that the UNHCR is not going to be able to undertake that in this different situation, who does he feel is best placed to undertake that key role?
Secretary.
My honourable friend raised a very good point. The Prime Minister has spoken to the UN Secretary General, including on this. I spoke to Jean No, the Special Representative for Afghanistan, and I can, without giving all the details, of course, the relationship with the UN will be one of the critical factors we consider in shaping the resettlement scheme.
Stuart C. MacDonald.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The government's Borders Bill would see hundreds and possibly thousands of Afghan asylum seekers arriving into this country in the months ahead, prosecuted in criminal courts and imprisoned for up to 4 years. How can the Foreign Secretary possibly justify that proposal?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, I'd just say to the Honourable Gentleman, we want to be a safe haven for those fleeing persecution, but we also want to encourage people to take legal and lawful routes. That's why we set them out. We don't want to encourage the kind of situation that we see across the channel. We want to make sure people come through the right channels, and I think that's the right balanced approach, and I think that's what our constituents will expect.
Mike Wood.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Whilst the Taliban's PR skills seem to have improved over the past 20 years, it's not yet clear that they're any less evil or oppressive with the new regime. Does the Foreign Secretary agree that there should not be any question of either Britain or our international partners recognising the Taliban government until we can be sure that they will meet their commitments on human rights, on terrorism and on humanitarian access?
Honourable friend, I think nails it. We don't intend to recognise the Taliban. The UK government doesn't, as a matter of practice, recognise governments, and the reason we don't do that is it allows us to engage and measure and calibrate our level of engagement based on what the authorities do, not just by what they say. I think the issues and the tests that he identified were the right ones, and we'll be watching very carefully what it does in the weeks and months ahead. I would just say that there is some evidence, whilst my scepticism is quite deep, but there is some evidence in relation to the engagement that we had on the ground in relation to the airport, that it is possible to have a rational, constructive engagement and be able to test whether they will keep their word. That was an early test. The ones that he described will be the next ones that we'll have to face.
Kirsten Oswald.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Prime Minister spoke earlier about helping Afghan friends of this country, but having been approached by some concerned constituents and corresponding with the Home Office, the MOD and the Foreign Office, it was extremely difficult to get any clarity about plans for evacuation of British Council employees, former employees and their families. Eventually, I was advised that even current British Council staff are not eligible for early relocation. So can the Foreign Secretary explain this very disappointing decision and what plans are now being put in place to help these Afghan nationals who put their own and their families' lives in danger by supporting the British Council over the past 20 years?
Yeah. I don't think that's quite right. We have been willing to look at British Council cases. Of course, it depends on the level of association, but more generally, if she's got particular examples where she thinks that that has not been done, she should write to me and I will look at them personally.
Mark Pawsey.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I wonder if the Home Secretary could say a little bit more about his assessment of the characteristics of the Taliban and agree that one feature they have demonstrated is extraordinary patience over 20 years, and that if, as some had called for, the occupation by Allied forces had remained for longer, the Taliban would have simply waited that extra time before making their move for power.
Foreign Secretary.
Can I thank my honourable friend? I think it's difficult to assess and to judge that with any precision, but one thing is clear, that they are proved a very effective force militarily. The question will be is whether they can turn that into governing Afghanistan, not just in a way that's more inclusive and more moderate, but also do they have the technical skills, the actual capacity? What would it be to form a budget? Can they get the airport up and running? And actually I think some of these bread and butter issues, away from the polemics of whether the Taliban has had some wholesale Damascene conversion, I think is going to be one of the really important tests in the weeks ahead. The Taliban at a political level are currently engaged in the process of formation of the government, and will be looking very carefully at the character and the composition of what is announced in due course.
Jonathan Edwards.
Diolch, Madam Deputy Speaker. What engagement will be undertaken with regional multi-state security collaboration such as the Shanghai Cooperation and the Collective Security Organisation, whose members all have an interest in checking international terror groups based in Afghanistan?
Foreign Secretary.
Can I thank the Honourable Gentleman? That's probably more the Home Secretary's domain than mine, but we will of course want to assess very carefully with all of our key partners and all of the sources at our disposal the nature of the security threat, and it's something that we're monitoring in real time.
Dr. Julian Lewis.
How careful is the government going to be before revealing very large numbers of names of people with a claim to come here to the Taliban until we know that they'll assist them in coming here rather than locking them up?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, my honourable friend makes an excellent point. We're going to have to test this. This is one of the early tests. I would say that in relation to the period of the evacuation, actually, given those numbers that we described, over 17,000 people, huge number of Afghan nationals, the 500 cases, particularly vulnerable Afghans, the journalists, the judges, the achieving scholars, the women's rights activists, suggest that they are able to give an assurance and then keep to it. But the question is whether we can build that into a more steady understanding to deal with the outstanding cases.
Janet Davey.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Secretary of State has said the Taliban have agreed for British nationals to leave Afghanistan. Does that include eligible immediate family members? Can he confirm what exit routes have been agreed with the Taliban, and can he say some more about the timescales? Days? Are we looking at days, weeks and months? And finally, can he also say more about the economic leverage the government and our allies have over the Taliban?
Foreign Secretary.
Can I thank the Honourable Lady? In terms of eligibility of dependents, the Taliban hasn't gone into that level of granular detail, but I think if there is a clear case of a British national and we're talking about immediate dependents, we would expect, and so far, certainly through the evacuation, we've been able to include them as well. She asked a series of other questions which are perfectly legitimate. We will have to see when the Taliban is willing to allow, whether it's willing to allow safe passage. At the moment, the challenge is that most of the third countries have blocked their borders, so actually that challenge is coming externally, but for understandable reasons. We're working and willing to engage not just with the Taliban, but all of those countries in the region, so that any of our cases that get to that border can be processed.
Raymond Chisty.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I first of all thank the Foreign Secretary for all he's done and the statement today. I have a specific question for him. The Prime Minister has said we're looking to set up a contact group. He said a broader coalition. Can I ask this specific question? What is the timeline to set up this contact group? What will be the specific criteria for membership? Counter-terrorism, humanitarian, nation building, and with regards to the format, would it be based on P5 plus region and plus other countries from the Middle East to get the money? What is the criteria for this, the group to be set up?
Can I thank my honourable friend? The truth is, actually, all of the points he made are relevant considerations. I think ideally we want the UN to coordinate. I think that would give it an independence and objectivity. All of the groups that he described would need to be considered. Of course, they don't all get on with each other. So this is also about the art of the possible. But I'm following through on that this week. We're trying to establish a core of a P5 consensus, not entirely straightforward, and then we want to consider all of the different regional partners, and they don't all have perfect relationships with each other. So this is partly the factors that he described, but also what is the art of the possible. One thing is clear, Madam Deputy Speaker, is we need a much broader group to be more effective in exercising and moderating influence on the Taliban.
Alan Brown.
Deputy Speaker. Did his department provide a risk and needs assessment to help the Home Secretary draw up the figure of 20,000 being the proper number of people to be resettled? What advice is it providing about identifying the 5,000 most in need to come in the first year? What advice is it providing to the Home Secretary about selecting the next 15,000 that need help, but they don't need help for a few years apparently? And what support are they going to get in intervening years before they're allowed to come to the UK?
Foreign Secretary.
Can I thank the honourable gentleman? Of course, we are advising and working very closely with the Home Office on the new resettlement scheme, the eligibility criteria in the way he described. I think if we had just said a year one commitment, he would probably be standing there and saying, but what about year 2, year 3, year 4? So I think it's right that we look both at the short term and the medium term, and the Home Secretary will set out full details in due course.
Siobhan Bailey.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. People in Stroud were really distressed to see the footage of a baby being handed over to an American soldier at Kabul airport, and we know that there are thousands of orphans stranded in Afghanistan and they're at risk of radicalisation and abuse. Will my right honourable friend confirm that children and orphans are a focus of UK support and say a little bit more about how we're achieving that? Thank you.
Foreign Secretary.
Can I thank my honourable friend? No one could fail to be moved by the heart-rending scenes at Kabul airport, the ones she described and others. We will of course look at what we can do in relation to orphans and unaccompanied minors. The real challenge will be getting verifiable details on their parents, whether they're still alive, or whether they're wider members of the family, because in the first instance, and this has been our experience more generally across the Middle East and in war-torn countries, we want to try and see whether it's possible to reunite children with either their parents, if it's possible, and safe to do so, or wider members of their family.
Dame Meg Hillier.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Like many MPs, many of my constituents who are British have family dependents in Afghanistan, and a number are saying they want to go to a third country like Pakistan in order to get them out. I'm advising them to wait until they get advice from the government. But is the Foreign Secretary having serious discussions with the Home Secretary about expediting cases that are already in the system, whether the biometrics and paperwork is already in place, to see if we can get those people through quickly to avoid clogging up the infrastructure in those third countries?
Foreign Secretary.
The Honourable Lady is absolutely right, and of course if there is a stock of cases which are, if you like, good to go because those checks have already been done, we want to make sure we're ready for the first flights out of Kabul, or indeed the first access that we can get via a third country. So that's very much on my mind and the Home Secretary's.
Rob Butler.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Over the past 20 years, and especially in the most recent weeks, the reason we've been able to see and hear so much about what's going on in Afghanistan is thanks to the bravery of many local journalists, especially women who, of course, weren't allowed even to work under the previous Taliban regime. So does my right honourable friend join me in praising them for their courageous work? And can he confirm that those who now feel at risk and need to leave the country are included in the categorisation of special cases?
Foreign Secretary.
Can I thank my honourable friend, and not only, he's absolutely right in what he said, not only are they included, but of the broadly 500 special cases that have actually been evacuated out of Afghanistan, there was a significant number of journalists, and of course we will continue to process those kinds of cases.
Stephen Flynn.
Madam Deputy Speaker, thanks to the Chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, we are all, of course, cognisant of the fact that the Foreign Office was acutely aware of the rapidly decreasing situation in Afghanistan in July. Indeed, July 22nd rings a particular bell. Yet despite that, the Foreign Secretary still proceeded to go on his holidays. So can I ask him, when's he going to find a backbone and resign?
Foreign Secretary.
Yeah, he referred to the risk report that the management board received in July. It's a standard monthly report. It goes to senior officials. It didn't contain any novel or new intelligence assessment. What the July document made clear was that our central planning assumption at the time was that the peace process in Afghanistan would probably run for a further 6 months. So we followed all of that advice, whilst at the same time preparing our contingency plans for the evacuation.
Chris Law. Ah. Yeah. Brendan O'Hara.
Yeah. An easy mistake to make, Madam Deputy Speaker. Spirit Aid, the charity founded by the Scottish actor David Heyman, currently has doctors, teachers and others and their families stranded in Afghanistan. On the 25th of August, the 28th of August and again on the 3rd of September, I contacted the Foreign Office, the Home Office and the MOD. I have no idea if these emails have even been opened. Will he commit to open the email, read the names of the people on those lists, and when will he be in a position to tell me, and more importantly, those terrified people in Afghanistan, where they stand exactly?
Yeah. Can I thank the honourable gentleman? As I said, I explained why there was a backlog of emails, partly the surge of new contact that we received in the narrowing window of the evacuation, and the decision consciously to focus on the resource of getting people onto the flights. But as has already been said before the House, we will make sure that we give a response to all of the MPs, honourable members' emails that we've received by close of play today, with the relevant signposting and triaging to the specific department that is processing that type of claim.
Mary Wilson.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I have a constituent, a British national, who was left behind when the evacuations ended. The Foreign Office have point-blank refused to even take his contact details or name. He's since risked his life to get to the border as instructed, but been refused entry to both Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, whilst watching other foreign nationals freely enter those countries. So could the Foreign Secretary please confirm why it's taken until today to speak to his counterparts in those countries, and when he expects to get an agreement so British nationals can enter those countries to return home?
Secretary.
I'm afraid she's not quite right about what she said. Most of those countries have closed their borders. We've spoken to all of them, pressing for a third country facility to get any UK nationals or indeed other Arab cases out. They're obviously concerned about encouraging a flow of refugees. If she's had specific problems with the case, please do get in contact with me, and I will, Minister Lord Ahmed will reply to and look at personally at that case.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In the last 20 years, Secretary of State, Christianity has grown greatly in Afghanistan. There's been over 200 missionaries who have come from different parts of the world to preach the gospel and have made that very, very clear. Many Afghans have accepted Christianity as their faith. The fall of government has meant that those Christians across Afghanistan are under great threat. Never has there been a fear just quite like it. Can I ask the Secretary of State what can be done to help Christians in Afghanistan at this particular time to get them out and get them into the free world again? Thank you.
Foreign Secretary.
Can I thank the honourable gentleman? Of course, those fleeing persecution or in fear of their life because of not just ethnicity but also religious belief will be part of the considerations for the resettlement scheme. And I think more broadly, providing some reassurance to those different communities in Afghanistan is going to be a critical first test for the Taliban. And as the UN Security Council resolution that the United Kingdom pressed for makes clear, we'll be holding the Taliban to those commitments and assurances that they've made.
Thank you, Foreign Secretary, for his statement. And statement, Minister Nadeem Zahawi.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. With permission, I would like to update the House on COVID-19 and our vaccination programme. Earlier this summer, we took the fourth step on our roadmap. We were able to take this step, Madam Deputy Speaker, because of our vaccines and the way that they are working. The latest data from Public Health England estimates that our jabs have prevented over 100,000 deaths, over 143,000 hospitalisation and around 24 million infections. Across the United Kingdom, we have administered over 91 million vaccines. 88.8% of people over 16 have had their first dose, and 79.8% have had their second dose. Our jabs are building a vast wall of defence for the British people. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, this vital work is not yet complete. With the Delta variant sweeping around the world, we have seen how it thrives on pockets of unvaccinated people. Last week, across the UK, we saw an average of 34,000 new cases and 938 hospitalisations each day. So it is vital that we continue to plug the gaps in our defences and widen and deepen our wall of defence. Over the summer, we have continued to do that in several ways. In August, the JCVI recommended that vaccines should be offered to 16 and 17-year-olds. They also recommended jabs for 12 to 15-year-olds with specific underlying health conditions and household contacts of someone who is immunosuppressed. We accepted both recommendations, bringing us into line with countries like Sweden. In recent weeks, 16 and 17-year-olds have been coming out to do their bit in droves, travelling with schoolmates and family members to get the jab. And we are taking the jab to people too, with walk-in and pop-up vaccination sites at football stadia and shopping centres, and of course university freshers fairs. I think we got to 20 universities. Over the bank holiday weekend, NHS pop-up sites at Leeds and Reading festivals made picking up a jab as easy as getting a beer or a burger. As a result of these kinds of efforts, more than half of 16 and 17-year-olds across the United Kingdom have received their jabs since becoming eligible last month. And this is in addition to over 3 in 4 18 to 34-year-olds, 76.3% of 18 to 34-year-olds who have already had at least their first dose. So much of young people's enthusiasm, Madam Deputy Speaker, I believe, comes from the fact that they've seen firsthand the chaos COVID-19 can bring. They have sacrificed so much and shown that age is no barrier to public spirit. I'm sure the whole House will join me in thanking them for playing their part in helping us all live safely. Madam Deputy Speaker, on Friday, the JCVI outlined their recommendations on the vaccination of children aged 12 to 15 years who do not have underlying health conditions. They concluded that whilst there are benefits to vaccinating this cohort, taken purely on health terms, that benefit is finely balanced. Building on the JCVI's advice, we will now consider advice from the UK's 4 chief medical officers and make a decision shortly. We have already accepted the JCVI's recommendation that 12 to 15-year-olds with the following conditions become eligible: hematological malignancy, sickle cell disease, type 1 diabetes and congenital heart disease, and those with poorly controlled asthma. And this will amount to an extra 200,000 teens becoming eligible. Madam Deputy Speaker, I also want to take this opportunity to address vaccination in pregnant women. Both the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists and the Royal College of Midwives have both recommended